from the preacher to the counselor to the lawyers and the judge. Yes, this one won't sit still, and that one won't budge. They got married on Halloween.
I bet the sun shines bright today in West Virginia. I bet they're glad to have you back. It's gonna rain all day right here. I'm gonna hold your picture near and cross that southbound railroad track. I will reach for you in the morning light. I will speak your name in the day. It's a cold, dark dream.
Councilmember Clay. Here. Councilmember Robinson.
Here.
Councilmember Siemens.
Present.
Councilmember Sniffer.
Present.
Councilmember Wright.
Here.
I'll give it a second to see if that calms down. First item on the agenda is council comments. Are my colleagues have any comments? Councilmember Clay?
I understand that either WSSC or Pepco is going to be in the Long Branch Sligo neighborhood again. This time digging a trench down a paper street on Jackson Avenue that ends into the Long Branch Creek. And the paper street is the only access way for people to their driveways. But I guess since it's not a city street, they're concerned that they've been told they don't actually have to do anything to replace it, so they can just leave it. I mean, they have to fill in the trench that they dig, but they don't have to do anything else other than plant grass. Could we find out who's operating in that and what our rights are and what the rights of the people who live on the paper street would be? Cool.
And can I just ask, is that the section going down toward the creek from Garland?
Yeah.
Because what I recall is that the city specified what that surface would be, and it was going to be those impervious pavers, and they were going to be put in by the developer of the house back there. And so the city specified the surface.
Okay. Well, I think maybe the utility companies have a different idea about that, and so maybe we could all communicate and get it worked out before they plant grass to replace the hole that they dig. And my other comment is that I went on the New Hampshire Avenue tour with the folks from the County Park and Planning and other council members who went along, and the purpose was to interest the planning commissioners in the activities that are happening along the New Hampshire Avenue corridor and the plans and everything that have been taking place, and to get to know some of the different businesses and get a good understanding of those. They were really impressed by the number of small owner-operated shops that existed both in the downtown, Old Town, because we drove through there as well, and along the New Hampshire Avenue corridor, and the lack of vacancies, and how all of the places were full. And as usual, our planning department, which was Alana and the new woman whose name I can't remember, Carmen, did a really great job. It was just very impressive. They're such terrific representatives for the city, and really on top of all of their stuff, and very knowledgeable, and handled an array, really a battery of questions that kept coming at them from all different angles and interruptions, and it was just really terrific. And so thank them for putting that together.
Councilmember Robinson.
I want to bring to the council's attention a draft of a proclamation and a flyer for the Veg Week or Vegetarian Week that's being proposed for April 24th through the 30th. I'd look forward to your feedback to see if we can get some traction on that. It's coming right up. I don't know if we have time to make a proclamation if we all agree that this is a good thing to do, but I'd very much appreciate some feedback on that.
Councilmember Wright.
I just wanted to mention again Community Gardens on April 20th, next Monday here during the City Council meeting. We'll have a discussion about community gardens, and I think Representative Irvin will be, Councilmember Irvin will be here to talk about that. And I think we pushed the time of the meeting back till 8:30. Is that correct, Mayor? And then also on the 21st, there'll be a community discussion about community gardens at the Montgomery College. The 21st Tuesday at 7 p.m., and it would encourage people who are interested in that topic to come. The third thing is that in the near future, I'd like to introduce a resolution which makes it very clear that we're still opposed to the metro development, that as it's been designed, even though the FTA has given their approval, I think the city should go on record still saying that we're opposed to it. Make it clear why we're opposed to the transit problems, and send that along to our many elected representatives, including Senator Ben Cardin and Chris Van Hollen, since they both sent in letters that pointed out the severe transportation problems with the plan, and like us, their concerns were not addressed. So I'll try and write that up and have it available for the next council meeting on Monday.
And I just wanted to note that the City Board of Elections and the City Clerk's Office ran a mock election on Saturday, and I think it was very helpful. I think we had 95 voters, and it was an opportunity for the Board of Elections and the Clerk's Office to learn what still needs to be worked out if we're to use that system for the election coming up this November. So it was very helpful for people to come down and vote on Saturday, and I want to thank everybody who did, and hopefully that will make the next election a smoother and better process. There was also at the same time Arbor Day was celebrated, and even though it was rainy, there was plenty of roof overhang to protect the people who were running Arbor Day, and I believe a number of trees were given away there as well. And then just a final note that tonight is the end of the legislative session in Annapolis, and supposedly at midnight they will be finished with their business, and then we'll know the final outcome of the good things and the bad things that they've done this year, given the financial situation that everybody's facing. So that will solidify some of the items that affect our budget and make it a little easier for the city manager to give a clearer picture of what those constantly moving numbers, what they are and where they end up. The next item is just an update on the agenda in the next couple of weeks. I just want to make sure that everybody is aware of the budget schedule. Coming up next Monday, we have a resolution adopting the strategic plan, and as Councilmember Wright noted, the community garden project presentation, and then pretty much the rest of the meeting is budget work session. We don't have a budget work session this coming Thursday because the council is hosting a joint meeting of the Montgomery County and Prince George's County Municipal Associations here. Then the next Thursday, the 23rd, is a budget work session. The following Monday, April 27th, is a budget work session. Thursday, the 30th, is set aside in case we need another budget work session. And then the adoption process for the budget starts in May with a final work session and reconciliation on the 4th. That meeting, we also have a presentation on the tentative presentation on the Tacoma Langley sector plan. And then the following Mondays, May 11th and 18th, we have the final budget public hearing, and then first reading on the 18th and second reading on the 26th. So that kind of takes us through the remainder of April and the month of May. The next item on the agenda is public comment period. That's for anybody who'd like to comment on anything that, let's see, we have public hearings coming after this, so if you're here to speak to the public hearing on the Constantine tax rate or the budget, if you'll hold your comments to those hearings, but comments on anything else are welcome now at public comment.
My name is Ed Sharp at 906 Clayswood Court.
And I'm Marie Rizzo from 7113 Central Avenue.
And we're here to just let you know, in case you didn't know it, I know there's really no baseball being played yet in D.C. We're not even sure that there will be baseball played once the team gets here. But in any event, the baseball season is starting. And the Thunderbolts, the Silver Spring Tacoma Thunderbolts, the college summer team that plays out of Blair High School, is starting its 10th season, which is kind of impossible to believe. Isn't it, Bruce? I mean, Bruce was an original board member. Marie was an original board member, along with myself and some others. I've given you each copies of the refrigerator magnet schedule for the season, and I'd like to encourage you all to look at that very carefully every night to figure out what games you'd like to come to. But you definitely need to put on your calendar Saturday, July 6th, again, Saturday, June 6th, against the Alexandria Aces, because we would like to have the council out throwing out the first pitch that night. We got some of you out last year. I'd like to take this opportunity to invite everybody to come out. I'd also like to, again, encourage the partnership between the city and the Thunderbolts that has existed over a number of years. And we have some specific things that we'd like to request from the city that don't involve any money. One of which is we'd like to put up some lawn signs on city property. Two at the corners of Piney Branch and Philadelphia, and then maybe one at City Hall, which is a regular lawn sign. I guess it'll get people in the mood for the election coming up in Tacoma Park in November, but it's just a lawn sign that talks about the Thunderbolts, gives our website, and tells about our baseball camps. Also like to get something in the newsletter, either in May and June or June and July, and finally like to get a poster someplace in City Hall, 11 by 17 poster, if we can figure out where it could go, and a prominent place to let people know about the Thunderbolts and the season.
And I don't know how you can turn this guy down, but I hope you all come out to the games, not only the opening game, but through the season, and see how many people really come out and enjoy it. Lots of families. It's really a good thing to do. It's inexpensive for most of our families, and most people have a really great time. So it's, I think, a real service to the community. And finally, if you know anyone or are inclined yourself to host a player, that's something else that we're very interested in, to keep some of the players in our community, to get to know Tacoma Park, for people in the community to get to know people coming from different parts of the country. It's been a great thing. So thank you.
We have concluded that there's an economic benefit to having the Thunderbolts. We haven't really done an analysis of it. We do bring people to the area who wouldn't otherwise come to the area, so there's probably an economic boost of some modest amount. I hope that is appealing to you, Doug. If anybody has any questions,
The hosting, that would be for the season, right? June
and July, yep. Yep, they arrive, the players will arrive at the last weekend of May is when they're scheduled to arrive.
Ed, I wonder if you could describe that a little, what you need from a resident to host somebody.
It's actually pretty simple. I coordinated the host family program for 7 out of the last 10 years, so I know this. But You agree as a family to provide a private bedroom for the player. You're obligated to provide breakfast items, but not prepare breakfast for the player. The player's on his own for transportation and dinners and other things. It's actually, I've done it. It's been a great thing. We're still in contact with the player that we've hosted. Some of them go on to do other things, which is exciting for the family to follow. And they're basically, straight aces. They're good, clean boys who, really focus on sports. We don't allow alcohol, drugs, of course, and they're very into the athleticism of what they're doing, and so it's a good experience all the way around.
And do the hosts get a free ticket to?
Yeah, you get oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Yes, and roses? Did they get roses at the end of the season?
No.
I thought we were going to do that.
Oh, well,
All right.
maybe on our 10th year.
And I'll just add that one of the players, I believe in the first season, who played for the Thunderbolts was John Papelbon, who's the closer for the Red Sox. So
Yep.
people do go on to do great things.
And we think that we got at least one other player who might make it to the majors this year from 2005. So, and if you could just let me know how we could go about making the arrangements, if possible, to put up the signs and stuff, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
If they eat a lot, maybe what we could do is limit the games to 5 innings so they don't consume so much energy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hello, my name's Thomas Nephew. I live on Birch Avenue. I'm here to talk about the license plate scanner issue that you'll be considering later on this evening. I begin by restating that I think the best policy would be not to acquire the scanner, but I know that others disagree with me on that. And I think that there are good elements of the draft policy that I have learned about. Foremost among them, that that data would be deleted from the device upon completion of a shift, and that it may not be downloaded without express authorization of the chief of police. I have been in touch with several of you about suggestions about policy, and I'm going to share a few of them now. I think that it would be, I noticed in the draft policy that in a number of instances there were exceptions to the guidelines that were provided for in the case of expressed authorization of the chief of police. I would suggest that any such authorizations be described as temporary, limited to a short time period, that those authorizations be reported in a timely manner to the city or the city attorney, that those entities should in turn report such authorizations in a timely way to the public, and that if they find it, if they deem it sensible to do so, that they reserve the authority to deauthorize the use of the scanner if they find that it's being not used, which I'm not saying I expect, but I think that there ought to be provision for that. I also would like to ask that the council perhaps petition the Maryland legislature to draft guidelines ensuring the proper secondary use of ALPRS, so-called data, automated license plate recognition system data, to make such secondary analysis subject to judicial review and approval in a way that is similar to electronic wiretaps. The legislature should also require the governor's office that hands out these grants to require civil liberties impact assessments of applicants, and it should consider broadly what the guidelines for public video surveillance ought to be. So thanks very much for the opportunity to comment, and I look forward to learning what comes next.
Thank you. Anybody else like to speak at public comment? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to the city manager's comments.
Just a couple items this evening. I would just note for the record and for the council's benefit that included in your agenda packet this evening is the annual report of the Facade Advisory Board. There were some specific recommendations in that report that the council may want to take up in the future and actually discuss with the board and provide some direction how you'd like to proceed. The mayor alluded to earlier that today is the end of the legislative session. I will be getting emails, hopefully, from our lobbyists as the evening goes on. But just a few items that I did want to call to the council's attention. One concerns speed cameras. Obviously, nothing's final until the session is over and the governor signs things into law, but it does appear that there will be some modifications to the program even for Montgomery County. Right now, citations are issued for anything over 10 miles an hour. At least the bill that the chief and I have discussed that appears likely to be signed into law would change that to anything over 12 miles per hour. There also appears to be some restrictions that will likely be put into place in regard to how long you can use the revenue and what amount the city may retain. So it does appear that some of our initial estimates may need to be modified during this budget process to recognize the fact that some revenues probably will flow back to the state. So we just need to get a copy of the final bill, and the chief and I need to review that with our lobbyist. The other thing that we're watching is highway user revenues. As the council is aware from prior discussions, we've already seen a drop in our highway user revenues this year. We weren't projecting any growth for the next fiscal year. It's my understanding that there will likely be a 10% reduction on top of what we have already seen reduced, which equates to about $52,000. Once again, that won't be final until this evening, but it does appear that all municipalities will take about another 10% hit in highway user revenues. While that's not great news, it's better than the 30% that was being talked about a week ago. On the good news front, has to do with program open space funds. There's been a variety of bills going back and forth in the legislature dealing particularly with the use of program open space funds for interior projects such as the planned renovation of this space. We got an email from our lobbyist around 5 o'clock this evening indicating that it looks like the bill is now going back to the way the Senate had originally talked about it, which, as you may recall, would exempt any project which was 7,500 square feet or less, which certainly this space would qualify. So there's another vote this evening. That's what I'm hoping to get something on my trio later tonight, but it does look like we should not experience any problems with the use of the POS funds. But we'll know that for sure by tomorrow morning. And that's it.
I just have a quick question on the Facade Advisory Board report. I noticed that there were a couple of members with expired terms. Was that something that we were also going to have anything back on?
Yeah, I think the city clerk's nodding yes.
They have applied for reappointment. Okay. Those are pending.
Good. Thank you.
That's it.
Any other questions? Okay. Legislative update. You kind of gave it in there.
Yeah, just kind of segued into that. So.
All right. So we are now at the public hearing. And the first public hearing we have is a constant yield tax rate, and I believe there's a sign-up sheet, and I believe, do you need to read something for this?
I believe Yvonne has the information.
Okay. Do you need to read something? I recall that in the past we've had to read something. Is that the case?
Yes. Good evening. I'm Yvonne Brooks, the Finance Director. Pursuant to Maryland State law, the constant yield tax rate is calculated by the Department of Assessment and Taxation for each taxing authority in the state. It represents the property tax rate for the coming tax year that will generate the same amount of revenue that was generated during the current year. As assessments increase, the constant yield rate decreases. When a taxing authority plans to impose a tax rate that is higher than the constant yield rate, tax rate, it must advertise the increase and hold a public hearing. An ordinance setting the tax rate is scheduled for adoption at the same time as the budget ordinance is adopted. The notice of the constant yield tax rate public hearing was published as required by state law in the April 2009 edition of the city newsletter. The city manager's proposed fiscal 2010 budget assumes the continuation of the current tax rate of 60.5 cents per $100 of assessed real property. This rate is 9.8% higher than the constant yield tax rate and will generate additional revenue in the amount of $988,723. Public testimony at this hearing is encouraged.
Mayor, if I may just add one thing. Ms. Brooks did just allude to the fact that the tax rate is due to be established at the same time the council is scheduled to take second reading on budget ordinances, just for the benefit of the public, because it is a requirement of the law that we announce, if you're not setting the tax rate this evening, of when you anticipate doing so, and that is scheduled for May 26th would be the final reading on the tax rates.
Right. So that this hearing this evening is required by state law if we anticipate going above the constant yield rate, and the constant yield rate in plain English is the rate that would return the same amount of money. So essentially, this constant yield rate would, if we say that we're going to spend any more money next year than we spent this year, we have to advertise this. Is that fair to say?
I would think it's reasonably fair to say the purpose of this hearing really is to focus strictly on those revenues that are generated from real property taxes. So if you intend to set a tax rate that would yield more revenues than last year's assessment, then you are required to hold this public hearing.
If the council, in its great wisdom, decides to set a rate that's higher than what's announced in tonight's, for tonight's hearing, do we have to do this again?
Yes, I believe so. Jesse, would you agree? Yes.
Terry, do you mean if we, the city manager has in the budget proposed that we keep the current tax rate, that we not move the current tax rate. And in my reading of the property tax increase sheet in our packet item, on number 4, it says the city of Tacoma Park is considering not reducing its real property tax rate. That's the city manager's considering not reducing.
Right. And my question is if we vary that to any degree, either up or down, do we have to redo this process?
As long as you do not, if you were to set a tax rate that is higher than 60.5 cents per $100, I'm not a lawyer, but my opinion is that you would have to hold a second hearing. If you do anything that is between the constant yield rate and 60.5 cents, this hearing would suffice.
Oh, thank you.
And I take it that the manager and Ms. Brooks's preparation of the budget is enough to say in number 4 that the city is considering not reducing its real property tax rate. But we haven't even considered it at all, we on the council. So I have a little bit of a nitpick here on number 4. I don't feel like I'm considering not reducing the real tax rate yet because I haven't even considered it yet.
But the problem is the state says we must use this language.
There is no flexibility in the language that you advertise if it is not, does not follow this precisely, and I believe this has happened sometime in the distant past.
We tried in the past to advertise it with something that was a little more understandable in plain English, and basically we were told by the state, you may not do that. You must use this language.
I think if we maybe when we consider this or hold this public hearing is another way that we've handled it in the past, is to hold it when we knew what rate we wanted to set, rather than do it at the front end of the budget process.
Well, I'm fine having it at the front end of the budget process. I'm just a little concerned that I haven't considered not reducing it, but I see that the language is in here, number 4, so I'm a little uneasy with that. Having said that, you know, if that's what the state requires, then I just wanted to make my point on that. I wanted to make that point.
And so hopefully this language, or this discussion, helps clarify for people so that your comments in the constant yield hearing might give us guidance and better advice on what it is that you would like us to know. Don't get tripped up by the language of what the state says that we have to advertise. So with that, we will take testimony on the public hearing on the constant yield tax rate, and we have 3 people who are signed up, and then we'll take comments from anybody else who's here who'd like to comment as well. So the first person who's signed up is Teresa Amordino, followed by Maria Horgan and Catherine Gibney.
Hi. I'm here because, of course, I'm opposed to any raise in property taxes. I don't know if anybody else here is, but I did speak about this at an earlier meeting that we were with the other you know, what's her name?
Oh, the District 20?
Yeah, Heather Mazur and all those people, but my point is still the same. I don't know why we're considering raising taxes that are already grossly higher than neighboring jurisdictions. So from my point of view, and they are because we have the extra tax for the city. I'm not saying they are because, you know, the other part of it, but for the city, yes, we're doing a double tax. And I've noticed now, in my 20th year of doing business, and actually since last year, of people actually deciding not to live here based on the significant difference in property taxes. For example, a little $350,000 house has a tax for the new owner of almost $7,000. The same house in Silver Spring, similar, you know, not exactly the same, would be more like $4,400. That's a big difference. That's a substantial difference, and it's starting to make an impact. It's also making an impact in the condo sales, too, which are not moving at all because condo fees have all gone up. Everything's gone up, but the condo fee together with $4,500 a year for a condo tax, it's not even a house, but a little condo, equals the mortgage payment. People are looking at those things and saying, I don't need to do this. So I think it's starting to negatively impact sales here. I really do. And there are places that have $10,000 taxes, and you know, it's beyond what it should be. I don't know why in a time when economic downturn and everything going on the way it is, that you would think about raising taxes. I just don't get that. But that's just me. So, I mean, that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing it becoming an obstacle. And I'm seeing a preference for Silver Spring over Tacoma, which, believe me, in 20 years I never saw. You probably didn't either, because you've been here a long time, too. But everybody always used to say, I've got to live in Tacoma Park. Now they're like, hey, look at this. I'm just saying. So that's my point.
Thank you.
Oh, and for older people, it's become a problem. For people who are trying to get near to retire, and you got a tax bill of $7,000, $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 a year, and your mortgage is down to almost nothing, it's kind of defeat the purpose. You've got to leave the town to retire. And that's happening too. So.
I was going to say exactly what she said, and I'm going to add a little more. I have lived in Tacoma Park for the last 23 years. I have a sister who lives in Bethesda, and I have a sister and a brother who live in Kensington, and I pay more taxes than they do. And Bethesda is supposed to be the highest income city in the whole county. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever that at a time when properties are going down, the price of properties are going down everywhere, and Tacoma Park is one city where the properties are going down, you guys are even considering raising taxes. Even considering is absolutely ludicrous. I don't see the services going higher at the same pace as taxes go, and I would definitely, and a lot of my neighbors would oppose even considering having taxes going 1 cent up. They should go down.
Thank you. And you were Maria Horton? Yes. Thank you. I just wanted it on the record. Thanks.
Okay, my name is Catherine Gibney. I've owned a house here, 10 years. And, you know, I was one of these people when I first came to Washington, I was trying to find the University of Maryland and found Tacoma Park. I got out, read the voice, and said, this is it for me. So I bought a house here. But I've been particularly dissatisfied in a lot of ways, but especially about this. Number one, I mean, it really was gibberish. I don't think any of us here are dumb people about what exactly is going on. I mean, I know a lot of people, I mean, they would be here. I don't know if this was advertised well or if the issue is understood. I mean, is there supposed to be another hearing? I mean, I personally just say, and I certainly think there should be another hearing on this for whatever it is. I mean, exactly how much are we talking about raising the taxes? I mean, is there a figure yet? I mean, what that thing in the paper that looked like it was 10%. Is that what we're talking about?
By keeping the current rate, but with assessed values going up, then people with those assessed values going up would pay, what was in there, 9.8% more.
Assessed values of their property?
So it depends on the assessed values of the property.
But who on earth has assessments going up?
Well, currently, your assessment, the state uses a 3-year assessment cycle, and therefore, all of the properties in the city of Tacoma Park will be reassessed next year, like 9 months from now, so that this time next year, we'll see the decrease in assessed values.
If there is.
Then the city should fight the county for doing higher assessment in Tacoma Park. You should represent us and say no more higher assessment in Tacoma Park.
Each person, telling each
Well,
person.
I would like to say that I am a senior citizen on disability, and I mean, this is going to kill me. It really will kill me. And I know Maria was talking about her sister in Bethesda. My aunt, she's moved from there now, but she lived on a nice piece of property in McLean, and last year my taxes were just a little bit under what hers were the last year she lived there, which was about 2 years ago. And I have to really admit, there's some things I see bothering. We're talking about taxes, and we see a playground over near my area, a nice playground. It's been redone real nicely, but why are we taking a playground that was okay and redoing it for, I mean, I've heard a figure of $2 million, and I don't know that, so I don't want to be saying, if I'm wrong about that,
Which playground is that, ma'am?
Jackson and Boyd.
Like 168,000.
How much was that?
What was it? 120. It was over 100,000, but under 200,000.
Okay, well,
And it
good.
was
I'm glad to hear it wasn't $2 million, but.
And it was all program open space
There is a,
money.
yeah, it was, ma'am, it was primarily funded with state grant funds, but there was a required city match. I can get that information for you if you'd like. I just don't have it with me this evening.
Well, I mean, $2 million, I wasn't sure about what I needed,
no.
but anyway, I think any sort of big amount of money, I see all this money being spent. I mean, I know it may sound silly, but even on these benches that are going up, they're really nice. But, and talking about the speed cameras, I mean, at my corner where I live at Lincoln and Carroll, I mean, I've heard about 5 or 6 wrecks over the last year. Have there been any really big wrecks on East-West Highway where those speed cameras are? Is there a speeding problem there? There is a speeding problem there? Yes. But anyway, and I've had some encounter, quite frankly, with both the police department and the housing department that hasn't pleased me a whole lot lately. So I'm really upset about this, upset a lot. And I think there are other people too, but it's just so confusing to start reading the newsletter what it's about and when hearing is what. So I would hope we could have another hearing and that we could, get out more people who I know would come.
I would encourage you to have anyone come down to the city council meeting on any night. Every time we have a city council meeting, there's an opportunity for public comment, and we'd love to hear people's perspectives on anything, including the tax rate. So there's no need for us to necessarily have a public hearing. We can encourage people to come down and talk on any single city council meeting.
So you don't encourage people to come down to the public hearing? What'd you say, you don't have?
No, I didn't say that. It was clearly published in the city newsletter. All I'm saying is that anytime anyone wants to come down, just like we had tonight, there's a time for public comments at the beginning of the city council meeting, and I would welcome, I'm just making sure that anyone knows, you don't have to wait for any special public hearing. Come and tell us about your concerns about the tax rate.
But I think on this one, which is obviously one that gains attention, and what's the readership of the newsletter, quite frankly? And this kind of stuff doesn't get covered enough. I adore the Voice, but it doesn't get covered enough in the Voice.
And if I can just get back to your question, which is there is another public hearing that we have scheduled toward the end of the budget process. This one is for the beginning of the budget process. Is there anybody else who has not spoken at this public hearing who would like to speak at this public hearing? Teresa, if you can just come back up to the microphone and just say what you need to say in like a minute.
Well, she was saying something and it triggered something in my brain and now it's gone. But there was one other thing that I do remember. On my own tax bill, I had gone, you can protest and get your assessment down. It's not that easy, but you can get it down a little. And I thought, oh, good, I got my assessment down a little. Then I opened my tax bill and it says, special assessment, $1,079. So my taxes went up a lot anyway. And I don't know what that item is for. Does anybody know what the special assessment are in a Jackson Boyd neighborhood for $1,000.79 all of a sudden? I thought that was a little...
Doesn't sound familiar.
Who do you call to find that out?
County assessor.
Okay,
Yeah,
they're not
there
returning
there should
home.
be a number on that bill.
Okay,
You can go by there too, it's at 500,
where is it?
it's right in Rockville, 500, what's the name of the street,
yeah.
Maryland Avenue?
Okay.
Teresa,
Yes,
call Valerie, do you know Valerie Irvin?
yeah.
Call Valerie Irvin's office and ask to talk to Amparo Macias. Amparo.
Okay,
I'll send you an email.
all right, that's good.
She's a great fixer of problems, and she can at least tell you what it's for. I don't have it on my bill, and I live in the same neighborhood that you live in.
I know. What did
So
they
first-
do on my street? Nothing.
You guys are special on Aspen Avenue.
Yeah, hey, such a deal, right? But something I think she was saying too about the fact that assessments are going up, you know, and I understand the three-phase cycle, and they slated them to go up. But I very rarely have seen assessments go sharply down, even though prices have gone sharply down for some homes. So I'm just wondering if we're really going to see that in the third year, like you're saying things are going to go down. I'm very skeptical that they would raise them, you know, lower them 100,000, 75,000, depending on what houses have gone down in certain areas. Have you noticed that any time? Because I don't think I ever have noticed them.
I've seen them go down, not by that amount,
No.
and we'll just have to see what they do next year.
The other thing that's a little bit confusing about it is that your actual, what you pay, your assessed value can go up to a certain amount, but what you're paying on can only go up 10% a year.
Yeah, no, I know that.
Yeah, so sometimes that's confusing to people because their assessment could be way up, say it's like $700,000.
Right.
It could fall down to $650, but they could still only be paying at $500, so that they would still be going up for a
That's
number of
right,
years.
but-
So that's a confusing element.
That's right, but what that essentially does, which is a really strange way of raising taxes without raising taxes, and you know this, all you guys know this, if for example, they're going to raise my taxes higher and they can't go beyond the cap of the 10%, that's okay. They raise them on the books, but they give me a credit, because I'm living in there, that brings it down within the margins. But then 10 years from now, as they've been raising them every year anyway, Joe Blow comes and buys my house, and Joe Blow gets socked with $4,000 more a year in taxes than I do, and it's a huge shock. So basically, you are allowed to raise taxes. You just have to wait till the tenant owner gets out. It's sort of like rent control, and then all bets are off.
Yeah, and your taxes are going up. I'm not saying that the taxes
no,
aren't getting
and I'm
raised,
not.
but I'm just saying it gets confusing for people,
No,
the
I know.
difference between
I know
assessed
it does,
value and what
but
they're actually paying.
it kind of is a sneaky way to actually get around keeping within that limit. You do it for the individual person, so that I don't feel all bent out of shape, but then whammo, $10,000, like mine is $6,600 or something absurd for a little shack, and then somebody comes and buys it and they're going to pay $10,000 a year, because in effect, you did raise the taxes all those years.
That's
just
the
how it
Welcome to
works.
Maryland fee.
What's that?
It's called the Welcome to Maryland fee.
It is. But anyway, that probably wasn't what I was going to respond to, but I can't remember.
That's the state, though.
Is what?
That's the state. The state came
yeah.
up with that great scheme.
Right. But does anybody know if you had a bill of $6,600, for example, you know, an average bill here, with your new proposal and the new rate, how much more money would we be actually paying a year? You said 10%. That would be $660 more a year?
It all depends.
Yeah, I know. Well, that's what I'm trying to figure out.
There's no simple answer.
Also, the Tacoma Park portion of this,
Right.
of that $6,600
Right.
is not $6,600.
No, that's the whole bill. That's my
Right, right.
special assessment, my Maryland, and my Tacoma Park.
Right.
And
so
your Montgomery County.
9.8.
My what?
And your Montgomery County.
But you know, for
Yeah,
new,
well, that's what I...
your argument about new buyers, for new buyers, it would actually be less, because last year somebody paid $700,000 for a house at 60.5 cents. This year they're only going to pay $550,000 or $500,000 for that house for 60.5 cents.
But it doesn't...
So it's actually
It
less
doesn't
money
work
that
that way,
comes in.
though, because it
But
doesn't go by the, you don't then take your bill and go up to the county and say, I only paid $550. It's still at the old assessment until
But
they
for-
redo it. It doesn't
No,
work,
it's
it doesn't work
to be-
instantly.
It's assessed at the price, at that point, it's the price point at which you paid for the house, isn't it?
No, it isn't.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, it is.
No, because the tax bill is submitted with the listing, the estimate for the new buyer. And that doesn't change unless you can go up there and say, my house is substantially less than that. And it doesn't work every time.
It gets
So you're-
reset at the new rate that they purchased the house. The reason, and I can explain to you offline why it happens that way in Maryland.
Well,
It's
I mean...
in a nutshell, it's because when someone in Maryland buys a house, the rate doesn't get automatically reassessed to whatever the lower or higher rate was, because the presumption is that the existing owner had already paid the taxes. So in Maryland, the new person usually then comes in and picks up that cost at the end of the term. But at the beginning of the new tax year, it goes to whatever the assessment goes to whatever that house was purchased at.
Settlement attorneys tell me it doesn't, over and over again, but I don't know.
But rightly or wrongly, I think we're going to finish with the constant yield tax rate hearing.
Voting no.
And I just want to make sure that anybody else who has not spoken at the constant yield hearing has had a chance to speak, and then we'll go on to the other hearing. Okay, so seeing none, the constant yield hearing is now closed, and we will move on to the public hearing on the city manager's proposed FY10 budget. And I see that there are 5 people who have signed up to speak, and we will take them in order, and anybody else who wishes to speak. Roz Grigsby, John Hume, Penny Jones-Napier, Sam Kittner, and Sabrina Barron, in that order.
And Mayor Williams, Pat Lovelace sent his regrets that he couldn't be here tonight. He's still home ill, and his comment was that he is hopeful that the council would have extra money in the budget to buy him a new backbone, because his is deteriorating to the point that he can't get out of bed anymore.
Thank you for sharing.
Hi, I'm Rosalind Grigsby. I'm Executive Director of the Old Tacoma Business Association. I am joined tonight by several members of the Board of Directors as well as local business owners. I'll do a quick introduction. Not all of them will have comments. John Hume, Patty Baker is the new Economic Restructuring Committee Chair. You may not have met her yet. Next to her is Ethan Landis, Landis Construction. Penny Jones-Napier is President of the Board. Sam Kittner, as you may know, Sam Kittner Photography here in town. And Sabrina Barron, who's also on our board. Did I miss anybody? I hope not. The Old Tacoma Business Association, through the Main Street program, is working in partnership with the City of Tacoma Park to build a sustainable and livable community. First, I want to thank you for your support in the past. Through our 4 Main Street committees, Design, Economic Restructuring, Organization, and Promotion, we're engaging residents, business owners, property owners, and volunteers to create the future we all want to see here in Tacoma Park. The Old Tacoma area is the downtown of Tacoma Park. We know that we're not the only commercial area in the city, and we're not claiming to be the most important commercial area in the city, but we are the downtown. Though our focus is on only one part of Tacoma Park, residents of all parts of Tacoma come to the downtown area. People come for the events like the Independence Day Parade, the Farmers Market, the Tacoma Park Street Festival. People come to patronize the local businesses here, whether for salsa or hip-hop dance classes, dinner with friends, music, gifts, or business events like the beloved Pajama Rama. And they come downtown for the opportunities to get involved, to plant flowers, to work for student community learning hours, to volunteer in making the town better. Old Tacoma is a critical part of the identity of Tacoma Park, the heart of the community where people gather and celebrate being in a distinct community among the greater metropolitan area. We're developing several new initiatives. They're mentioned in many of them are mentioned in the packet I've given you, including new quarterly art walks to increase foot traffic and provide a platform to promote our unique retail character, as well as a new festival that is underway called Dance Animus, highlighting the many new dance studios and businesses teaching classes in town with a very diverse crowd of all kinds of ages and backgrounds and people coming to dance. We will continue new programs begun in 2008, along with a partnership with a VISTA volunteer at Montgomery College working with ESOL students at Montgomery Blair High School and Tacoma Park Middle School. You'll see some of their community service learning hour forms at the back of the packet I gave you, talking about their experience in participating in the community. We need your support to continue the work we do. In the midst of a global recession, our local independent businesses need your leadership. To continue to be a living town, vital, changing, diverse, and engaged, we need a living business community. Main Street Tacoma works in partnership with the city for the same goals that Council has established as priority, a sustainable, livable community. And I will turn you to, I know I'm out of time, very quickly to the bottom of page 3. I wanted to highlight how we leverage the funds the city gives us in support of the town. For the $30,000 that comes from Tacoma Park City Council, we double that amount in revenue we bring in. We match it again in volunteer hours. And in 2009, we will multiply it by a factor of 9 in grant money that comes through us into the community. So our contribution in match to your $30,000 is $365,000 for the year of 2009. Thank you.
Thank you.
John, you want to go next? I think we may be out of order. We signed up late.
That's okay. Yeah, John was signed up next.
Good evening. My name is John Hume. I live on Carroll Avenue in Ward 3. I'm here tonight to invite everyone, but especially our esteemed council members, to come out and help make our Main Street Tacoma sparkle in this year's 4th annual Main Street Tacoma Spring Cleanup Day. Cleanup Day will be held on Saturday, April 25th, from 9 a.m. to 12 noon. May 2nd is the rain day, but it won't rain. This year, as before, we'll be gathering at B.Y. Morrison Park in Tacoma Junction, at the Clock Tower on Laurel Avenue, and at Triangle Park on 4th Street across from the Metro. And we're going to be picking up litter, we're going to be weeding, mulching flower beds, planting colorful annual flowers, removing graffiti, and generally making our Main Street, our city's living room, look like it should, because company is on its way. Company is coming. All we're asking for you to bring are your helping hands, your enthusiasm, and your desire to demonstrate that while Cleanup Day really is every day of the year, we're going to take set aside one special day to celebrate working with our Main Street, because our Main Street works with us also. So come on out. We have the trash bags, we have the recycling bags, we have the gloves, we even have the tools. We just need you, because that's what Main Street Tacoma is made out of. It's made out of you, everyone around me. And when you're finished, drop by the back of the co-op. There you're going to see where Main Street Tacoma is partnering with the co-op, with Montgomery College, Montgomery Blair High School, Tacoma Park Middle School, and the Vista ESOL program to build an innovative keyhole garden, showing our community how simple and fun it is to grow fresh vegetables and achieve greater food independence and a healthy lifestyle. Keyhole gardens are low impact, low maintenance, low water, high production, intensive gardening plots. They've saved thousands from malnutrition in southern Africa, and now Main Street Tacoma and its design committee are bringing this concept to our hometown. In fact, I'm going to be building one in my own backyard, but you can see right now what may look like a pile of rubble and dirt behind the co-op. Soon it will be our field of dreams. Now, Main Street Tacoma is an initiative of the Old Tacoma Business Association. We derive our structure from OTBA, but our inspiration comes from our volunteers. This year, our inspiration comes from one of our ESOL students, student volunteers from last fall's Fall Cleanup Day. That student's assessment is included in your OTBA handouts, but in case you haven't gotten to it, I'll give it to you now. I learned that making happy the community makes you happy. So welcome to our Main Street, and come on out on the 25th. Thanks.
Thank you. Penny Jones Napier. Okay. Sabrina Barron.
I'm Sabrina Barron, President of Historic Tacoma, Inc., and I sit on the OTBA Board of Directors representing nonprofits. I've been sitting on the board for 2 years now. I also volunteer on the Design Committee and the Economic Restructuring Committee, although that committee meets at sort of 7:30 in the morning, so that's a little bit more of a challenge. But I want to talk in particular about the facade improvement program that OTBA has served as the umbrella administrator for in conjunction with the state of Maryland. And this is a program that provides funding for facade improvements, anything that can be seen from the street. And My organization, Historic Tacoma, if you've seen our building at 7328 Carroll Avenue at the Junction, has benefited from this program, helping us rehab our bay window in the front, the roof on the bay window, copper cornice work, downspouts, and so on and so forth. And many other businesses and storefronts in the community have benefited from this program as well. 7001, 7003 Carroll in Old Town, the former Taliano spot, former House of Musical Traditions, current House of Musical Traditions, I guess, the Co-op, Savory, and a lot of improvements, a lot of repairs and beautification that you see going on through this program. It's a matching program, and it's a fabulous opportunity. It's a fabulous program. It's free money to help you with the facade of your property. And OTBA and Main Street are now inaugurating a facade improvement program for businesses in the DC portions of the commercial corridor, OTBA being a cross-jurisdictional organization. And that's very exciting for a lot of the businesses and storefronts in that area. So, it may not be big splashy things, but if you notice the improvements as you move through the commercial corridor, Main Street is behind a lot of those. Design Committee has done so many wonderful things, planting in Old Town. Summer before last, in drought conditions, essentially 2 members of that committee carried almost 5,000, how many? Almost 5,000 gallons of water in gallon jugs to water the petunias and keep Old Town blooming and gorgeous. And John can give you statistics on how many cigarette butts have been removed from the commercial corridor, planting, mulching, now the Keyhole Garden Program. Michelle Morgan has done some great stuff, planting around the co-op, moving, bushes from her garden to the co-op area. So it's a really dedicated group of volunteers that it's been a privilege and a pleasure to be a part of and to work with, and to accomplish all of these things for our community. It's not something that's not going to pop immediately and be a big splash. It's something that's cumulative over time. And OTBA has been making a difference in the past few years, and I hope you'll support them in making a difference in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sam Kittner, and along with my wife, Bobby, we are business owners as well as commercial property owners, as well as proudly over 16-year residents of Tacoma Park. I just want to express our support for the City Council's continued support of OTBA and its Main Street mission. It's critical work, mostly taken on by not only the volunteers, but the Main Street manager, Roz Grigsby, who's just done a great job. We need to make sure that we continue the financial support of the city so that we can continue to have her there to spearhead this important mission. The downtown, Tacoma Park's downtown is our main street, and in a lot of ways it is the physical face of Tacoma Park, not only to our residents who live all over the city of Tacoma Park, but to the greater DC region as a whole. When they come to Tacoma Park, I'd venture to say 80 or 90% of the time they're going either directly to the Main Street area or going through the Main Street area. So it really its health really reflects the vibrancy and the condition of Tacoma Park. So obviously we need to invest in it to continue to make it a fun, vibrant, safe, and happy place for people to visit. So this support's critical. Also, it's a great investment by the city. It complements the limited staff resources of the city towards the goal of the city's economic development interest, and again, to make it a fun, safe, vibrant place to be. While our downtown has its ups and downs, I think that we've got some really neat things going on down there, especially with the plethora of classes and businesses that are catering to children and adults and older people, and the kind of music arts and dance thing that we've got going on suddenly downtown. It's really something to build off of. Hopefully as the economy turns around and we have some of these store vacancies, we can fill in with businesses that will complement those classes so people can come downtown, learn things, have fun, get something good to eat, pick up a few items, whatever. But we need to have this structure in place, and I would just end by imploring you to support the OTBA and continue the funding as stated. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Patty Baker, Chair of the Economic Restructuring Committee of OTBA. And we wanted to talk for a little bit about the revolving loan fund that we have, a grant from the state of Maryland. It's $125,000 that we have received that we can use for businesses in Tacoma Park for capital improvements. And we have, so far, we have 3 applications for these funds, and we're advertising this money as available for other people who might be interested. We will make decisions about how to use these funds sometime during May, maybe at least by June, and the projects need to be completed by November so that the money can be gotten to the business owners by the end of December. And once the money has been let out and the people repay it back into the fund, we will have money coming back in that we will continue to be able to use to support business owners and businesses in Tacoma Park. And this is obviously, we hope to be a program that grows and really does help small business owners in the city. And we're very dependent on having good administration ability to run this program, and we can't really imagine doing it without the support of the City Council. And we just wanted you to know how important it is to us that you are part of this, what we think is a very exciting opportunity for all of us in Tacoma Park. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, good evening. I wanted to talk briefly about how the Old Tacoma Business Association has paid special emphasis on encouraging fellow businesses and particularly developers in our community to be as green-focused and sustainable as possible.
And can you give us your name?
Ethan Landis, sorry, Ethan Landis Construction. We worked with Gables Residential, and we've worked with Douglas Development, which we know that their project, while stalled at this point, they have designed it to be a LEED Silver project when they do develop it. And our committee met with them and encouraged them to strive for this standard. The OTBA has actively encouraged developers that want to pursue projects in the neighborhood and to design their buildings with an emphasis on sustainable design. This has included Elevation 314, the building that my firm built, the Landis building, and we applaud your efforts to renovate this auditorium to be LEED certified. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we get to the name at the bottom of the list.
Honorable Mayor Williams and Council, how are you this evening? You know, I've had a lot of our colleagues that have come up and spoken to you about the importance of continuing with the Main Street program. The bottom line is this: it's a bad economy right now. We all have to face decisions that are affecting our budgets, and I understand that you all are too. With your help, we have, over the years, accomplished a great deal. In 2000, I think it's in 2006, you asked us to do a SWOT analysis, which we did on our organization, so that we could justify the money that you were contributing to us. I can tell you today that we've accomplished 90% of everything that was brought up in that SWOT analysis. We followed it to the line. We have applied for grants, which we are using as pass-throughs. The facade improvement program in Maryland has been in effect for several years now, and we have issued quite a number of grants to applicants and help them improve their facades, which are visible to the eye but hidden basically from the general public. We've instituted ways in which we can do streetscaping. We have a revolving loan fund which has the ability over a long term to affect many businesses in our community. It has taken us a long time to reach out on the D.C. side, and as many of you know, I'm a D.C. resident and a D.C. business owner. But it has taken us a great deal of time to reach across the lines and get a NIF boundary moved, which is a neighborhood investment grant in Maryland, in D.C., in order for us to be available to have grants in that community on the Tacoma D.C. side. We have it now, and we have a facade improvement program starting this year. There are many things that we do in your community. We do outreach to people that are outside of this particular ward. As you heard from John Hume, we've got a program right now where we're working with English as a second language students. It's very exciting to hear them be so in awe of what they're learning. Now, this is a little outside of our bounds as a business association, but it's part of a Main Street program. We need your help. We have a lot of grants that are given to us, but we have no operational funds. We have been working on developing new programs to raise funds to help with operations, but they take a while to do. We've done small baby steps with small things like the book sales that we had last year. We have several knitting programs that have been co-authored with Now and Then. We have a new festival that we're planning, which is a performing arts festival, not only focused on dance, but all the performing arts. And I think that it could lead people to be coming into Tacoma Park as a new venue. We have a lot of new young people moving into our community, and we need to address their concerns also. But we have to have your help with operational funds. That's the bottom line. So I'm coming to you today to tell you that we need to be able to have a staffer still put in place. We're working to raise more funds so that we can have additional part-time staff to help to continue the programs that we've put in place over the years. And I hope that you'll hear us and you will applaud the things that we've done, even though they're a little bit under the radar. We don't stand up and get credit for a lot of things we do in the community. We do it because we're passionate about this community. I love living in Tacoma, whether it's on the D.C. or the Maryland side. This is my home, and I invest a lot in it. And all the people here who invest in their businesses invest a lot in it. And the stakeholders in this community, the people who pay taxes, the people who own businesses, they want a place that's central to be able to come to enjoy themselves. You're getting new restaurants in, a lot in part because of pushes that the Business Association has made. Because of the marketing study that we just completed this year, we're going to be able to give more advice to people who are trying to bring businesses into the community. And we need your help. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who'd like to speak at this public hearing on the proposed budget? Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing on City Manager's proposed FY10 budget. And again, just remind folks that there is the opportunity to speak at any public comment period at the beginning of any of our meetings about the budget or anything else that you'd like to speak about, and that we do have scheduled a second public hearing on the budget Monday, May 11th, as we start trying to wrap up our discussion of the budget. Thank you all for your comments. Next item on the agenda is our work session item on the discussion of the license plate scanner policy. And I see the chief and a number of people from the police department are here. Welcome.
Good evening. You have before you for this work session the automatic license plate recognition scanner. Since our last visit before the council, we've done extensive research. We have now drafted a departmental directive, which I believe addresses the issues that were brought up by council to us when we appeared before. We've done some research throughout the country. I'd like you to know that most departments have not drafted directives, and I would tell you this is probably the most extensive directive drafted up to the state. 2 weeks ago, I attended the Police Executive Research Forum's annual conference for police chiefs, and one of the topics discussed was this. They have been studying it. They're getting ready to release a report at the end of the year, but everything so far has been very positive. This has become a valuable tool in recovering stolen autos and apprehending wanted persons throughout the United States. In doing a little history, in talking to PERF, this original program started in the United Kingdom over 4 years ago. They experimented in 22 police departments in England, and over a 13-month period, they had arrest figures of over 13,000 stolen autos and wanted persons. It has been used here in Maryland. It's been very successful. In one shift, Maryland State Police made 6 arrests and recovered 2 stolen autos when they were testing it out. It is being used throughout the metropolitan area now. We intend to put it most likely on an unmarked car. We'll have special people trained in our tactical enforcement unit, so they'll be the only ones within the department that will be using it. We think it's a valuable tool for law enforcement. We think we've put guidelines that meet some of the concerns raised by Philip. We attended a session along with Councilman Siemens, and I know the mayor stopped by, where we heard some of the questions. The one thing I would report to the council in talking throughout the country, there has been no opposition raised. ACLU has reviewed it and has watched it very closely, but at this point there are no pending lawsuits or civil concerns about this. Basically, this, like any other tool in the police department where you have a directive, comes down to the guidance and leadership of your department, and your management is expected to hold people accountable on how things are used. This guidelines is very specific. If it's going to be changed for any reason, it will be a decision by the Office of the Chief of Police, being me. And I believe we've put strict guidelines in to avoid any abuses. Although there have been none reported so far, we always have to prevent that. I would ask that you quickly make a decision, because we have asked the state to delay. They have to have a decision within about the next 30 to 40 days, so we have to get back to them immediately. If you have any questions, Captain Corsi, who was the applicant for the grant, and Jack Van Wagen, who did our research throughout the country, and Lieutenant Bowers in the Patrol Division are here tonight to answer your questions.
And can I just first ask you a question, which is, if you can just say a little bit more about the when there might be exceptions that come from you, what you might envision, why that would come up.
If there was a homicide investigation, let's say we had a homicide here on Maple Avenue, it's a good place, at one of the high-rise departments, and we were looking for certain cars.
Can we assume that's somewhere else?
You can assume it's at Hayward and Lincoln.
A homicide investigation, a rape investigation, or a robbery investigation where there was a concern that the car had been seen in the area, and maybe we had a description where we would want to look at the tag number to see what kind of cars were in the area. I don't see it being used very often. I haven't seen a need for it up to this point. Fortunately, we don't have homicides here in Tacoma Park very often, and hopefully we won't in the future. And recently, because of cooperation from our community and working with other jurisdictions, we've been able to close a lot of cases. It's a tool that would be there, but I would only see it in a major case, which would be a major exception.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Councilmember Stipp.
Yes, thank you, Chief. This does, in fact, address my concerns, and I really appreciate your incorporating them. Whether you took my advice or somebody else's doesn't really matter to me. I think it is a well-crafted policy. I'm glad to see the safeguards that are in here. I think they actually are quite workable. I like the way you attended to the can we actually implement this kind of way to look at it. I had one question and a concern. On the first page under 04B, it it says the operator, upon receiving an alert, would then initiate or cause to be initiated a query to the appropriate database. And I guess my question is, would there be a pursuit of the vehicle? Are you going to wait for the query, and then if it's a real hit, you go after the vehicle? Or are you going to go after the vehicle, stop the vehicle, and then do the query?
Well, it would depend on the circumstance. A lot of times you're just riding through, just taking tag numbers down. If it was a vehicle that was moving, you'd stop the vehicle. And like we normally do, if we get a hit on a vehicle, we have to confirm it, and we confirm it through our dispatch center, so we would use the same process.
Okay, okay. That's what I thought.
It would be
That's what made
probable
sense.
cause to make a stop, and then we'd have to confirm it before we can make an arrest.
Right, right. It's just as if you had memorized a tag number and you saw the tag number, you'd go make a stop, and then you'd verify that in fact the tag was right and all the other stuff. Yeah, so it's, okay. So that's a question. And then the other concern was one, it was also raised in the public hearing a bit. I'm a fan of, when you do any kind of exception, I'm a fan of having time limits on it. You know, that it be an exception for some period of time, or in the sense of that there's a review of it. It's not a permanent policy change, in other words. It's an exception, and the exception would have, I don't know, you know, whatever your judgment is.
Well, I think it would depend on the case. I mean,
Exactly.
if we make an exception,
Right.
obviously I can tell you from the way we operate now, I'd be reporting to the city manager, I've made an exception. It'd be up to her, and I imagine, knowing how she does things in the past, she would notify there was an exception and the reason for it and how long it'd be. I mean, you're looking at tag numbers that are involved in an immediate case. I can't see it more than 2 or 3 days because they're going to be gone. The tags
Right.
that would be specific. So I don't see anything long-term. I don't see that
Well,
as an issue.
that's the process I like, that you were just outlining. And if, you know, if you can come up with some words to put in here, I think that'd be a good idea.
If I could suggest, the wording suggested to me, at least when we crafted it, that there wouldn't be any kind of blanket permission.
Right.
So that it would only be on a one-time basis. So if that's not clear, we can make it clear that
Yeah, something like
that
that.
would only be done, one scan, for instance, could be downloaded only if that particular scan was authorized by the chief. But not that we can do scans on every third Thursday, and that would exist for forever. That it's supposed to be expressly
And my
authorized
concern
by the
isn't
chief.
even one scan. My concern is that that you specify what it is, depending on what the particular issue, the reason for doing it. If the reason was you were going to scan for 3 days, because you thought, you know, the vehicle would show up again in 3 days, that would be fine too. Just something specific about it. That's all I was looking for anyway.
Councilmember Clay, and then Councilmember Stevens, and then Councilmember.
Hi, guys. I love reading all these reports you keep sending me about people you're arresting who are doing bad things in the city. So thank you for that.
Oh, yeah, hear, hear.
We could have more reports with this tool.
Well, I support the license plate scanner, which is no surprise to you.
Yeah, definitely.
But I'm also concerned and sensitive to the various issues that we face and the sometimes poor choices that people in the state government have made regarding citizens to come apart. My first question is this, the general orders, this piece here, is this the entirety of the regulations regarding how this will be used, the policies and procedures?
Yep.
There was a previous document, though, that circulated. Is that not right? Wasn't there a previous version?
There was this
This is
one about.
this is the revised version.
Okay.
Yeah, much better too.
So, I'm a police officer. I get into my car. I'm certified to do the scans, and I turn on the unit when I get in the car, and I drive for 12 hours, and that's my shift. And it collects information on license plates that are going by or that are in parking lots. And I'm going to leave that on for my entire shift. I'm not going to turn it on just when I go past the corner of Hayward and Lincoln and shut it off when I go through Ward 1.
7401 Maple
But when I go by 7401 Maple Avenue, because no crime happens there, and we all know that I'm always yelling at my children. So that's not going to happen, right? I'm going to leave it on for my entire 12 hours of my shift, because, is that right?
I think it could be left on for the entire shift. We won't be sure until we actually have this device how much of the officer's attention it will take, so that it could be turned on and turned off if it becomes a burden to one of his other duties that they may be addressing.
It's just like when we do, it's a tool to look at vehicles.
Sure.
And we tend to have our tactical enforcement unit, which is our plainclothes unit, have it. Obviously, I don't expect them to be riding around the city all the time. I like to see arrests, and they've been pretty good at doing it so far. So it's a tool that we'll be using during the shift, and I think what Ed said is correct. It may be a cold night and nothing's happening, they'll be checking more tag, and maybe a night where we're very busy and they won't even turn it on. It's just going to depend. I mean, we're not going to use it every night because they don't work every night. But they're the only people that are going to work it at this point to restrict it. That's the 4 officers that are in that unit.
And are those going to go on cars that are take-home cars?
It'll be on a unmarked car.
Which is not a take-home car.
Well, it probably will be a take-home car, but that's something we'll have to look at from a security standpoint, how safe it is, can we remove it, and those are questions till we get it, and when we get it, we won't know how we'll use it. It may, if it turns out to be, we think it's a security risk, then it'll be put on one of our spare unmarked cars.
Okay. Well, I would certainly, unless it's a nuisance to the police officer, like to see it on the whole time that they're going, because I think that's how you catch the Amber Alert people. I mean, we don't want you chasing down folks who fail to pay their vehicle registration or have strange administrative issues with the state or federal government and wasting our time on that. But it just seems like, for the purpose of catching the bad guys that we're looking at catching, that we would want to have it on as much as possible, especially if we had the investment. So then the other question is, then it seems like right now we're going to do, when the shift is over, then that data disappears.
It's purged at the end of the shift, that's the rule.
But that's not common across the country. Across the country, 7 to 30 days is more common, right?
Correct.
Okay. So I was thinking about the sniper guy. And I was thinking about I was trying to imagine, what are the reasons why you might want to keep data for 7 days or 30 days or 0 days, and what you would lose in that time period. So what do you lose by dumping the data at the end of the shift? How often do you get situations where it would actually be useful to look at data over the last 3 days to 7 days?
It is a useful tool to be able to look at data, but balanced against the privacy concerns, that this was the option we chose. We're not even sure exactly how much data will remain in the device, depending on how much it's used. The more it's used, the less data you can store in the device itself. And there was nothing in this...
Because it rolls over.
Yeah, there was nothing in this grant to obtain any kind of separate database to be able to download the extracts.
So what's in the machine stays in the machine?
Pretty much
we purge
to the machine.
Okay. Okay. Well, this seems like a good starting point then. Thank you.
Councilmember Stevens.
Thank you, Mayor, and I thank all of you for this policy. I think this is fantastic in its addressing the many community concerns that we've heard. I have about 7 questions, so I'll run through them real quickly. In section 03B, I just wondered if it says the scanner of license plates viewed by the device, including potential images of the plates and vehicle on which it is displayed and information regarding location it was viewed by the scanner. I just wondered if that shouldn't also say the date and time, and location that it was viewed.
We can certainly insert that.
On section 5, B1, it says that one of the extract downloads envisioned is for NCIC stolen vehicle, etc. And I wonder if that also includes ICE detainers.
Well, they automatically come up, but the same rules apply.
Okay. So you'll know at the time that the machine goes off, you'll look at it and say, oh, the officer will look at it. You won't be driving it. the officer will look at it and say, oh, that was an ice detainer, so I just can ignore that.
He will get a hit and then have to confirm with NCIC what the hit's for. If it's for ice, it's the same rules that apply now. We don't do anything.
Okay, but he'll know that before he actually goes out and queries the NCIC database again.
Before he would know if he got an ice hit before he made, let's say he was driving along with he would not stop the vehicle because we're not allowed to under the sanctuary law.
But it would take the inquiry
Well, if
to
it
find
was
out
just,
what, because the ice warrants are in the NCIC database.
correct.
Therefore, you have to go to the next level to sort within NCIC to see what it is.
No, we don't even go that far. If it's an ice hit, we're done.
But you know that from this device?
They'll come back, sometimes they'll come back and say, this is an ice hit, and which would be an administrative warrant for somebody for ice, so we.
But the device would tell you that?
No, we'd have to, the device would tell us we have a hit. When we check the hit, if it says it's an ice hit through NCIC, we're done.
Okay, and to check that hit, you go to the NCIC
Yeah,
database.
that would be a standard practice. We'll get a hit, then we have to confirm what the hit's for.
Okay. Yeah. And I think that was one of the questions originally was that this then would be logged in NCIC database, that any query was made on that tag at that place. But if you make a query on the tag in NCIC database, it records that you've made that query at that time, right?
Correct. Same way we do business now.
It's the same as if the officer had done an inquiry on their own reason for suspicion.
Okay, in Section 5C, again, this is the exception, and there's another one on the other exception where it requires the police chief's authorization. I would just like to see that there's, that the council is notified when those exceptions happen.
How do we, question for the city manager, what process do we use now wherever we have something where we get notified, like on the taser?
Chief, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but general orders or directives are internal police department policies. This is really more just a matter of practice between the chief notifying me when a taser is used and my notifying the council because you have requested that I do so.
Right, so it's just our request to you rather
Correct.
than going in a general order?
Correct.
Thank you.
And you have to realize if it's an investigation confidential in nature, we would not be able to reveal that information to you.
Yes, and that would...
You've got to be careful.
That would be fine. You know, we will get notified when it's, you know,
When we can get
appropriate
notified.
or when we can get notified.
Okay.
Right.
All right, I'm fine with that.
Okay. And then in Section F on the next page, I guess it's under Part 6. And this is, it says that operators should be aware in certain cases, such as a match of an MVA record for a suspended driver's license or an NCIC record for a wanted person, the driver or occupant of the vehicle may not, in fact, be the person who, for which the tag is associated. In these instances, the officers should obtain independent reasons for believing the operator is likely the suspended driver excuse me, or wanted person before initiating a traffic stop. And I'm thinking for like a suspended driver's license. Today, if an officer was driving down the street and she saw a vehicle that she became suspicious about, at that point, then she might check the tag and find that the operator's license was suspended, but that wouldn't be enough cause to pull the vehicle over because you wouldn't know who was in the vehicle. And I'm just wondering if this isn't changing things around a little.
The way that our current rules are written, we use for the mobile computers, is if you get a hit on a tag for a person, you want to make at least some kind of visual check that the person closely matches the description. If the registered owner of the motor vehicle is the mayor, but Mr. Clay is driving it, you would not stop the vehicle because clearly they can't be the same person. But on the other hand, if the physical descriptions were similar, you could stop the vehicle, make an inquiry as if they were the same person. And if that was the case, then you would have somebody who was operating on a suspended license. But you want to at least make some attempt to verify that they are, in fact, close enough in resemblance that you have some probable cause.
All right. And lastly, I guess, is kind of my bigger question, and that is the amount of time involved. You mentioned the fact that this is very good at identifying and finding stolen vehicles. And I think from past experience, that many of the stolen vehicles that we get are from other jurisdictions, not from Tacoma Park. And I am wondering about the amount of time that will be involved in processing these vehicles, because if you have taken into account staffing-wise what impact this will have on the amount of time for the traffic stop, the arresting the individual, booking them, the paperwork involved, and the court time involved, if we're going to be increasing the number of arrests that we're making on that, are we going to have sufficient, are the officers going to have sufficient time left to do the other crime work that we want them working on in Tacoma Park, or are they going to be tied up in court with these cases?
I would tell you it's another tool to help us to increase our arrests and to recover stolen autos. I think if you look at our statistics from last year, arrests were up, closures were up. We did very well with the 42 officers you've authorized. I have high expectations. We're going to raise those numbers again this year because we want to obviously continue to reduce crime in the city. I think you can see from our work last week that we've made quite a few arrests and we'll continue to make them. That is not a concern, Councilman. I think we have sufficient people. I don't think it's going to take away from any of our duties. I think it's just going to make us more effective to make our community safer, which goes along with the principles you have in your strategic plan.
Right. I appreciate that, and I especially appreciate seeing all those arrests that you sent the bulletins out to the press earlier this week. I think it indicates an excellent job, and thank you very much.
Welcome.
Councilmember Wright.
Well, first I want to say a couple of thank yous. One, I want to say a thank you to you all for investigating this technology, being aggressive and looking at new ways to improve policing, so I commend you for that. Second, I want to thank you for really listening to the community, listening to us, and coming back with a policy that I think is a very good starting point, and I think honestly pretty conservative as a starting point. If we want to investigate doing anything differently in the future, we can talk about that, but I think this is a good starting point, so I want to thank you for that. And then I also want to thank the citizens, in particular Thomas, who's here with us today, who's done a lot of research and I think been very helpful to us as council members in giving us resources to read through to help us think about that. So thank you to you, Thomas. I had a couple items. One, I guess, some of them are items that have already been reiterated, but I feel a little bit uncomfortable of this point of this being a written memo which kind of guides the police department but doesn't necessarily incorporate something like the chief needing to notify maybe through the city manager when one of these exceptions is done. And the concern I have there is that I have a great deal of faith in Chief Rakucci, and I hope he's here for a very long time, but these things do have a tendency. Someone new comes in, and they sort of want to say, okay, I wonder what the policy is related to this equipment.
We can, I'm facing with you, we're going to incorporate.
Yeah, so I think it
we'll
should
notify the town manager that we've made an exception to the rule, and then the only thing I say that exception will depend on confidentiality when she notifies you all.
Right.
We will make it, it'll be automatic notification when I make that call, or any future chief of police in Tacoma Park.
Yeah, and I agree with Ruben that it's understanding that it could be time sensitive to an investigation, but eventually we would get to know. I think the big thing for the council would be, Laura, there are a lot of, do we hear a lot of exceptions going on? Then we would probably say, oh, maybe the policy needs to be reviewed, or we need to discuss this. I think we should add something about training. I don't think it specifically says in here that the officers who are using the device will be trained, and because it does sound like, you know, there's some specifics on how you should use the device, I didn't see in here anywhere where it's explicitly said that the officers who use the device would be trained. Only officers who are trained appropriately would be using the device.
You said that in the draft.
Maybe I read it somewhere earlier, but I didn't feel like I had seen it this time when I was reading it.
How about looking down at 6A, only officers certified by command,
Oh, yeah.
lawful permitted,
Okay.
and that'll be people that are trained.
Okay.
Okay?
Other items. I think we should explicitly say that if the policy is going to change, it should come before the council for review. I'm sure that there's other times when you update the policies within the department where you don't bring all of those changes forward for review, so I think that would be good. And then I also would like to see that there's because this is something new, that we commit tonight to, in 6 months, coming back and sort of reporting to the council on how the device is being used and what is, what you're finding about it, and how officers are liking it, what we're learning from it, how it's being used. So those are my big things, the exception one being the most important. I also agree with Thomas's points that I think we should, it's not our duty, but we should ask the state legislature, not you guys, but the council should ask the state legislature to look at those things that Thomas raised. I think they are important and would potentially prevent abuses that happened previously with the state police, or help to prevent those things. And then lastly, I think I just wanted to touch on something that Colleen, I think, was raising with, when is the scanner on, and the aspect of somewhat sort of where the scanner is used in the city. So I'd be interested to sort of know that when we come back and review it. My concern, and I think Colleen was sort of alluding to this, was we don't want a device like this to be used for profiling a certain neighborhoods or certain people. And that could de facto happen if it was used, for example, heavily in Ward 4 on Maple Avenue, as opposed to Ward 1 on Maple Avenue. So I think that question of it being on when they're driving around, you never know where that suspect's going to be in the stolen vehicle.
Well, the research, one of the reasons this scanner is used by a lot of departments is to eliminate profiling, because they basically leave it on and go wherever they go in their patrol.
Right.
So they're not, it is a tool that was developed, and a lot of the explanations and data that I've received is to eliminate profiling, because you're not looking at one neighborhood, you're just, and basically I would expect they'll be left on unless they're outside the car,
Right.
Stop. They have nothing to lose by leaving it on, and we're just riding throughout the city, and any one patrol, TU obviously in some nights are targeting an area where we've had robberies, which would be, let's say, Ward 1 or your ward when there's vandalisms, and it would be on in that neighborhood looking for cars to dump along in that neighborhood that may be suspect in a crime later that night. So this tool has been developed to eliminate what exactly you're talking about as profiling.
Yeah, so I think that's good to hear. That I think that was the explicit thing I wanted to hear. I don't know if Councilman Clay also wanted to hear that when they're on patrol, regardless of where they are, they're going to be using the device, unless there's some extenuating circumstance where they're. So. Thomas, you were raising your hand earlier. I didn't know if you had a question or a comment, or did it get answered by something that the council members had asked?
You would need to be at the microphone so we can hear you.
Microphone, just so it's on the record.
Just when the discussion about the ICE hits came up, maybe it got answered. It just seemed to me like if you call in to confirm that there's an ICE hit to that agency, then you've basically telegraphed to that agency that a person with that license plate is in Tacoma Park.
We don't call in an ICE hit. We get an ICE hit, that's the end of it.
I see. Okay, well, that was my question. I didn't understand that.
It sounds like it would be the same procedure as now.
Correct.
So that's all my...
Okay. So if I can just check with the city manager on my sense of next step where we go from here. My sense from my colleagues is that we like this, the material that we've been given, the general order. It sounded like you were going to add a thing or two to it.
We've got about 2 things to revise, which we will do tomorrow. We'll get it up to Ms. Matthews as quickly as possible.
and that you would then send it along to us and say, here's the revised version, and the operative assumption being that that addresses our needs, and if anybody has an objection or a question, they would get back with you, and so that this could move forward expeditiously. One question I had was about the best way to handle, from your point of view, the question about any change in policy and review of that. My sense when that was brought up was that that would be something that the chief would bring to you, and if you felt it was necessary to bring to us, you would bring to us.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I do think that Councilmember Wright's comment, and I don't think the chief has any opposition, I'm guessing, is that in 6 months that we would just basically schedule a time through the mayor just to sort of review how it's being used, and I guess at that time, if we're finding that any change in policy is warranted, I think that would be an appropriate time to discuss that with the council.
Okay. So, and we'll just put that on the agenda for October. We'll do that now.
Great. I had one more comment that I just remembered is that, I commended you for your aggressiveness in going after this grant money, but I think because of the sensitivity of the issue, if we are going to pursue additional grant money to, for example, if there's grant money that becomes available to have a database, as you said, this grant money doesn't include money to have a database or a place to store data if we were in the future going to collect it for hold it for 7 days, that before a grant application is made, that we just get asked if we're okay with it. And I'm not saying any grant application, I'm saying because this type of thing is particularly sensitive, anything having to do with this or video monitoring, I think it would be helpful for us to sort of talk about it briefly so that we don't get this sort of cart going before the horse and then end up in a situation where you guys have applied for something and then gotten it or spent time on it and gotten it. I suspect we would probably be okay with it if the case were made and we understood what it was for, but I just think that would be helpful. So I just go on record as saying that I think would be good future practice.
Mayor, the one thing I would just note in terms of scheduling this is obviously the department has to go through the procurement process and bring back an ordinance for the council's consideration, so we may want to look at having a work session presentation with the council shortly after the first of the year, because we don't have the device now, so if we're trying to go out 6 months, that you probably want to bring an ordinance forward, Chief, till what, May sometime? Or do you have a vendor identified?
Maybe
Okay.
May.
Okay.
Kind of right.
If we can ride on the contract, which is the direction we're headed, we can get it here in a week or two.
All I was trying to do was to make it so that, given that there's an election in the fall, that we didn't have to start briefing potentially new council members, and they go, huh? And we just do it with this council.
Certainly, we can try to do it in November, just recognizing that it'll be more limited use in 6 months.
Yeah. So we'll put it down for kind of the end of October. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
And we'll take a short break and come back for our budget work session.
Jeremy's ready to go home. He supports that. Be kind to the Gazette reporter night.
So I think the city manager is going to give us her treatise on general fund and funds and debt service and something else.
Right.
Non-departmental.
Non-departmental. I'll try to make it a little bit more interesting than a treatise, but no promises. There's only so much I can do. So, what I think would be helpful is, does everyone have your budget binders with you? I hope. If you can turn to the section in your budget binder that's labeled Fund Summaries, and go back 4 pages to what's titled General Fund Summary. What Yvonne and I would like to do tonight, I guess, is just sort of give the council, before you get into the individual departmental budget work sessions, is sort of the broad picture of what the general fund looks like After we go through that, then as the mayor mentioned, I would like to go into a little bit more detail about two of the budgetary units, which would be debt service and non-departmental. Basically, what the general fund summary, as it implies, is sort of a overall picture, very broad-based, of what the general fund looks like as proposed. And I'd just like to go through both the revenues and the expenditures, just sort of touch on any highlights. Some of this will be a recap of what I presented last Monday, or highlights of the transmittal message, but see if the council has any questions about some of these points. Kind of going through the revenues, just a couple of things I'd like to touch on. I think, as you already heard this evening and last week, my proposed budget does not reflect any change in the current real property tax rate of .605 per $100 of assessed valuation. As I noted in the transmittal message, I think obviously tax rates are something the City Council always spends quite a bit of time during the budget process talking about. And I would just comment that basically over the last few years, this has been something that the council has taken very seriously and has actually dropped the tax rate fairly considerably during my tenure. It was 66 cents, I believe, when I started, not quite 5 years ago, and last year the council has, through a series of steps, has eventually lowered it to the current 60.5 cents. This question always comes up from the council is what is each either penny or half cent on the tax rate? How does that ricochet through the budget? If you want to consider doing that, and Yvonne has run the calculations, for every half cent reduction in the real property tax rate, by the time that cycles through personal property, railroad and public utilities, and other types of taxes, each half cent equates to a revenue reduction of $95,400, roughly.
Can you say that number again?
Sure. It's approximately $95,400 for every half cent reduction in the real property tax rate. I guess some other things just that fall into the category on this sheet of taxes and utility fees that are probably worth noting. One of the largest sources that comes into this category has to do with income taxes. And as I mentioned last Monday, this is probably one of the revenue sources that Yvonne and I spend a considerable amount of time talking about when coming up with our revenue projections. And I think one of the things that makes it notoriously hard to predict, and I think every governmental jurisdiction struggles with it, is that you have a lot of variables going on. The tax year for which income taxes are being collected don't correlate to fiscal years, so you basically, have that variable. Certainly you have people's income tax returns being reviewed or audited, and adjustments being made. The demographics of Tacoma Park, quite frankly, are much different than many other communities. The county has projected, I think, Yvonne, correct me if I'm wrong, but about anywhere from, I think it's about a 5.5% to 6% reduction in income tax receipts for next year. Part of that, I think, is when you look at the overall demographics of the county, they tend to see a major impact in terms of, capital gains and investments. We have, up until the last year or two, there's been sort of a correlation between what the county sees and its income tax receipts. That blew up about 2 years ago, and we spent some time during the preparation of the budget talking to the county's chief economist, as we do every year, and basically that correlation seems to have fallen apart because the county essentially got over-distributed and then there was a correction. So since that correlation sort of fell apart for the last year or two as we looked at it, Yvonne and I had to kind of make our own judgment, and what we have elected to do for the budget that's before you is basically to leave income tax receipts flat. The state is projecting statewide about a reduction of about 1.7%. Just with what we've seen, I think it's a reasonable guess that we will basically be flat and not see the kind of loss that some other governmental jurisdictions are projecting. That's obviously something we'll continue to track, but it is a fairly significant source of the city's operating revenue, so I did want to mention how we came up with our projection. As I mentioned earlier this evening, highway user revenues, we're already going to see about a $76,000 decrease from the budgeted figure for this year, and based on at least the information that I have, and we'll probably know more tomorrow morning, I do expect the number that is in the budget to need to be further reduced by about $53,000.
Which number is that?
If you go back beyond the general fund summary, back 2 pages, and that's kind of the breakdown of the revenue section.
Which number were you just?
It's the highway user revenues. Just to provide some kind of context, the adopted budget for this year, and these numbers came directly from the state when we put together the FY09 budget, was just over $601,000. We have received 2 revisions to our projections for highway user revenues for this year, so we're now down to about $525,000. Based on the guidance from the state, the proposed budget reflects highway user revenues of about $527,000, and I'm expecting the state to further cut the allocation to the municipalities based on their own financial problems. Like I say, that originally was proposed to be a 30% reduction, and I know at least the mayor, I know, did send something to the state legislators, and other council members may have done that as well.
Barb, this year's proposed real property is 1152.
Right.
And last year, the estimate is 9968. Is that?
That's the current year, yes.
This
Right.
current year. So the difference there is a little over $1 million.
Correct.
$1,000,001 or something
Right.
like that. And the increase that was listed on our earlier document about the constant yield tax rate
Was about
980
nine.
or something like that. So where's that $700,000?
Remember that, I mean, we're basing it on the assessed values that we get from the state. The constant yield, Yvonne may need to help me out here, but it's really looking at it based on an adjusted value. So when we put together the budget for the current year, just as we're doing this year, you get information from the state. There are obviously people who are protesting their assessments, and those things are going to shake out. So the base essentially that the state is using for the constant yield calculation would be somewhat different than the base that was used last year to prepare the budget. I'm not sure that's helping you, but there's essentially a different way of calculating it.
Okay.
Does that help at all?
Well, sure. It's
Okay.
a different way of calculating it. Is there a common sense explanation for it, too, that's in there?
Yvonne, do you want to help out here? Mine was a little too techy.
Well, my experience in looking at what the county does on the collection, the accessible base is forever moving. They're making adjustments throughout the year.
And that question came up during the public hearing about, and it sounded like there were some differences of opinion about whether the assessed values change as properties change hands. And my sense is that part of the reason that it's changing throughout the year is that they do change.
Yeah, my understanding is the same as Councilmember Clay's, is obviously as you remain in your home, essentially the 10% cap doesn't really change the assessment of your property. It is essentially a cap for taxation purposes. Once the property changes hands, it rises back to the full assessed value.
Or drops down.
Or drops down.
To the sale value.
Right.
And a
if you-
year after
Right.
I purchased my house, well.
The first full year.
The first full year, $362,000, and that's what I paid for.
Right, and if you go out.
That's not a coincidence.
Yeah, if you ever go out and just look at the State Department of Assessment and Taxation data, it will list prices, sales prices of homes, and that is why it is showing there, because it will kind of correlate to when there's an adjustment.
And so one could go in that website and look at a house that you know recently sold.
Correct.
And see the change.
Correct. Right, so I think as Yvonne said, it's just constantly a moving target as properties change hands, as assessments are protested.
So probably weekly or more often, the number on which calculations are based changes.
Right, and when the state, we get our data from the state at the latter part of February, and that's basically an adjusted value for FY09, for example, and that's where essentially they calculate the constant yield rate over whatever that assessable base is in place when they do their own calculations, and they provide us with the constant yield tax rate.
Another question, if I might. The charges for service on the first of these two pages went from 988 to 774, and I'm trying to winnow that out in the detail page.
If you can be patient, I was going to walk through the significant changes if I could.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. So basically, I think what we've already talked about is sort of the highlights of taxes and utility fees. I can just go two more, Councilmember Robinson, I'll get to your question. The council may note that there's sort of a drop in fines and forfeitures. As you may recall from last year's budget, when we were first talking about implementing the speed cameras, the thought was that we would just take the speed camera revenue and essentially account for it in the general fund in fines and forfeitures. Based on the volume of what we're seeing, and I guess just talking internally about what the state law requires, the decision has been made to set up a separate fund. So what you're seeing in fines and forfeitures from the current year budget versus the projection as well as next year's estimate basically just reflects the fact that we're going to take the anticipated revenues from speed cameras and account for them in a different fund. It's not a true reduction, it's just a change in accounting. Use of money and property is essentially investment income. I think everyone's probably painfully aware in their personal lives about what's been happening with rates on CDs and savings accounts and treasury bills. So basically, we're seeing a dramatic drop in what we're getting in terms of investment returns, and that's what you're seeing in the much lower number for the use of money and property. In regard to Councilmember Robinson's question about charges and services, I think as the council is aware, but just for the benefit of the public, we will get essentially payments from WSSC when they're going to be tearing up a road or doing road work, and they will make a 50% contribution that the city essentially saves that money to when that street comes up for resurfacing. Those payments from WSSC get booked in charges and services. So what you're seeing for the current fiscal years, we expected to get $140,000 from WSSC. Darrell has advised Yvonne and me that we will probably get $220 this year, which just has to do with whatever streets WSSC is going to be making that 50-50 payment on. And then next year, they're not expected to make any payment at all, just kind of luck of the draw of what streets they're working on.
I see.
Does that help?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I could have looked and seen that. Thank you for bringing it.
Sure. The miscellaneous category in revenue obviously also looks on the surface like it's dropping. It's really the reduction is really a function of two things. I think it was last fall, the council, or early this year, the council approved a new copier lease. We were changing out all the copiers throughout the city. We still have some time on the existing lease, so the new vendor essentially gave us a $30,000 roughly payment to basically account for the fact that we're making payments on two sets of copiers. So that $30,000, which is a one-time payment, got booked into miscellaneous revenues. The other revenue source that is not continuing into the next fiscal year is the payment that we used to get from Montgomery County for operation of the temporary day laborer site. With the opening of the Prince George's County site, obviously, we shut our own site down and Montgomery County's payment stopped.
Right.
So I guess those are just some of the highlights. I'm certainly be happy to answer any other questions the council may have about revenues, but those were the things I kind of wanted to call out and make sure that the council was aware of.
I'll just make the observation that every revenue category is pretty much the same, except for property taxes, which goes up. So we're basing, according to this, unless I'm wrong, we're basing all of the increase in our expenditures, or all the increase, we're counting on property tax to fill in the gap for all of the increase in our revenues, unless I'm reading this wrong.
I would say it's probably not all of it, but I would say it's certainly the predominant portion of it. There might be small line items where there's some minimal increases that are anticipated, but I think your assessment is fair.
And I would say that, kind of looked at from a slightly different angle, when everybody else is crying and reducing what we get from them or holding it level, like the rebate from the county or, highway user or program open space and all those things from the state, the only place left to hunt for the revenues to deal with whatever you've got to deal with, like payroll and fringe and things like health insurance and all those things that tend to go up, that you don't have any control over. That's the only place that you're left.
Totally aware of that, but I'm just making the point.
Yep.
If that's the way it continues and everything else drops, and we have a continuingly growing bill, and it will continue to all fall on the shoulders of property tax payers. I don't see a commercial tax component here, which is, or a business tax component, which is large enough to catch my eye, or I don't see other categories in our revenue stream that we can rely on.
Right. The things that we've relied on in the past are grants, and go out and find other people's money that we can use to do what we want to do, and the property tax percentage of our revenues used to be in the high 40s,
Right.
and probably nudging 50%. And over time, I think we worked it down to the low to mid, not the low, mid to upper 30% of total revenues. And then recently, it's been going back up, and now we're at, what is it, 54%?
It's just under 54%.
In this proposed budget.
Correct.
So it points out the importance of finding other sources of money, but in times like these, they can kind of dry up.
Probably the only other thing I would just mention in response to Councilmember Robinson's comment, which I think is a very apt one, is if you look under the more detailed revenue page to under intergovernmental revenues, there's a category about 5 down called police rebate. This is really not what is typically considered the tax duplication from Montgomery, payment from Montgomery County, which, as we've talked about probably ad nauseum, has basically been held constant for a number of years. But this police rebate is a function of a provision in county code. And if you'll notice from the budget for this year, that's actually gone up fairly considerably. It's roughly $706,000 this year. We expect to get, based on information from the county, about $799,000, and then next year, based once again on information we received from the county, it's about $855,000. So that's probably one area where I would say, Councilmember Robinson, where you see the most significant projected growth. This is basically a provision in county code that makes a payment to Tacoma Park for, it's tied to police services, and it's essentially a set rate based on our assessed value. So I think what you're seeing in the growth there is also a reflection that the city's property values are still up, essentially.
And if I can just point out at the top line of that intergovernmental revenue section where it says police protection state, my recollection is that is the amount of money that we get from the state for providing police service, which essentially was their way of saying, okay, all of the revenues from the tickets that you write locally are state tickets. It goes to the state, and we say, well, gee, if we have the police go out and do enforcement, it's not like the money's coming to us, it's going to the state. This is their payment to us for that.
Right, and what you'll see is they come out every year, and I think Yolanda and I think probably Captain Corsi work on it, but it's tied to our actual police, public safety related expenditures. They essentially come out, we show what we've spent in any given year, and essentially they sort of do an audit and calculate what the benefit is likely to be for next year. When we were going through the construction of the community center, for example, because some of those expenditures were tied to the public safety level portion of the building, we were able to delineate those expenditures to the state and actually get some reimbursement. So if you were to go back a few more years than what's shown on here, that number might have been up, but it was tied to capital expenditures that did not continue once construction of the building ceased.
I think the point that Councilmember Robinson is trying to make connects back to the strategic plan, which is one around financial sustainability. And so I do think that, there is a concern in my mind, at least, about the property, real taxes that people are paying on property continuing to go up. And it's one of the questions I actually have to sort of understand a little bit more, because we still are benefiting from this run-up in values, and where most people, or a number of people, are under their true assessments and what they're paying taxes on. And I think you will really start to get into trouble when we eat up all of that rise, and then also the only way we can increase the rate, the actual taxes that people are paying, are to start bumping up the rate. So it's not going to be based on the fact that people's properties are actually valued at more. They have a real asset that's valued more, and then they're paying higher taxes, but they would be bumping the rate up. So one of the questions I have is, do we have any sort of sense of where we are related to how much we're bumping up against assessed properties versus what we're actually taxing people on? Is there any way to tell them?
The data that we get from the state is very aggregated. Truthfully, when I was looking at putting this budget together, I just went out, truthfully, and kind of randomly went out on the state database and was trying to look at what's happening with individual properties. It's very, very difficult to try to get that sense. I believe when Councilmember Elrich was on the Tacoma Park City Council, we went through, I think this was right after Yvonne started, went through a lot of gyrations trying to get better data and to break it apart. And I think it's almost impossible to do, quite frankly, in terms of what you can get. I know Yvonne had talked to folks from the county and the state. I think your point, Councilmember Wright, is right on. One of the comments I made in the transmittal message is I think the reassessment will be very, very critical to what happens to the city in the future. I agree with you that I think some of what we're seeing is sort of that bump from assessments that exceeded the 10%, over the last 2 years. And if we were to see, I think, even a fairly nominal drop in property values, I think that's going to force this community and all of us sitting here to really make some very hard service delivery decisions. And I guess my encouragement in my transmittal message to the council is you start that dialogue with the community sooner rather than later, and really try to get a sense that if we find ourselves in that position where we have to, or just because of the concerns you heard this evening, you feel that we need to make a drastic reduction in the property tax rate that's reflected in my proposed budget, I think you're going to need to have that discussion with the community, because I think it will involve potentially some very painful choices. And I think ultimately that's a discussion I think you want to have before you get into a crisis mode.
Right. And I think that leads me to my second point, which is I think it will behoove us to really be able to think about the citizens like a consumer, and say, okay, if they're paying $14 million in taxes, try and understand, because it's so complex with the rebates we get for this and stuff from the state for that, for the money that they pay to Tacoma Park, and break it down into concrete things that people can think about. Okay, my trash pickup costs this, my police department costs this, and what I pay in taxes. Then that you can really say, for your $14 million, these are the things you're getting, and this is how much they're costing, and if you want us to cut one of those services, what does it really mean?
I agree with you. I think as you go through each of the individual departmental budgets, one of the things that you'll find on the departmental summary page is trying to, and it's not a perfect correlation, but what is the money, for example, for police services do we get from the state? What do we get in tax duplication payments? What do you, and this is not the reason you do it, but what do you generate in fines and forfeitures because you have a parking attendant? On each of those pages, there is a net number which is kind of quantified as a general fund contribution. And in my way of looking at that is sort of where people's taxes are going. It's the net cost of providing that service to taxpayers. And I think, there's not a perfect correlation because, for instance, if you have, you cut officers, truthfully, that taken to the extreme could affect your rebates. If you cut a crossing guard, for example, your payment from the county goes down. But I think that's maybe a good way of looking at it.
I think we do need that next level down. Because it's confusing for someone to try and sort through and figure out. And then the second is that, depending on the department, police, for example, we actually get a fair bit from a combination of the state and the county and different sources from the county. Whereas something like
My
the
department is...
library, your overhead.
My department is the perfect one. As we joke about internally, we're the biggest sucking noise on the general fund you can imagine, because other than passports, we're not involved. I mean, Yvonne didn't invest money. Right, it's pure overhead. But anyway, if you look at those pages as you get ready to meet with the various departments, that is intended to sort of give you an idea of what that net cost is to the community.
Councilmember Clay had a question, and I had 3 comments.
Comments first?
The first one was, I wonder if it, as part of that discussion that you were just talking about, if it might be a good idea for us to kind of revisit and reread either our copies or new copies of the TASD report, because my sense was a lot of that analysis went into that report. And it's a good way of kind of thinking about how to present that, and gets into all of those complexities about, if you say, delete a department, what you really save, and looking at the different ones that way and understanding that.
I think that would be helpful. I think as you go through the individual departmental budgets, certainly we can try to flag some of those issues for you as well, and we'll try to make a point of doing that when we send out information for each of the individual agenda packets.
And I just wanted to share that one of the sessions that I participated in at the Maryland Mayors Association conference in February in Annapolis, we had situated municipalities talking about what we anticipated with upcoming budgets this year, and I would say the near unanimous opinion of people was that this year was not going to be kind of the hard year. Next year would be the hard year. And I think that is doubly the case for us because of the year in the 3-year cycle that we're on for the assessments. With that reassessment coming next year, it's going to get at what some of Councilmember Wright was talking about. And the third point was, when looking at jurisdictions who don't have the Maryland system with the 3-year assessment cycle, and in the case of Montgomery County and some others, the 10-year, the 10% limitation on increases. But just looking at a jurisdiction that kind of reassesses every year and doesn't have that percentage on it to see what the effect is, in a way, it's a little bit of an extreme example, but it's kind of the poster child for being out there kind of in a free market tax setting is Prince William County. And I'm going to be a little bit off in these numbers, but I believe their current year tax rate is something like 96 cents, and their proposed and adopted rate is $1.24, so it went up like 28 cents.
It went up, as I recall, I think it was like 25 to 35% in terms of the actual tax rate, just trying to tread water because their property values have tanked essentially.
Right. So that when people talk about the tax rate, they raise their tax rate by that much to essentially keep the same money coming in. And so the system that we operate under kind of evens things out over time, and they're kind of left to deal with the troughs and valleys and peaks.
And it's a death spiral for them, right? Because then the housing becomes less affordable. The people are paying more in property tax, right?
No, they're paying the same, it's just the
Well,
rate changes.
it depends.
But no, I think they're actually also paying more, aren't they?
They may be paying more.
And you can talk about in the aggregate, and then you can talk about individual cases, and they can be different.
Yeah, I think it's a very typical boom and bust cycle that you see in high-growth communities anywhere place across the country. You're seeing it in Prince William. You're seeing it in Loudoun. I have a former colleague in Missouri who's the manager of North Las Vegas. Nevada, which has obviously been one of the most, hard-hit states in terms of foreclosures and declining property values, so.
Sure. First, I'm going to comment on that piece. We've had a slow rise in the property values, and so our constant yield tax rate has always been less than what our current tax rate is. But in their case, their constant yield tax rate would go up. And so it'd still be a constant yield, and they may have gone up over that. But your rate can go up and down and not necessarily have that kind of a correlation to what they pay. And I think that's what happened tonight is people glom onto the rate instead of what it actually means for a tax bill, which, because of the homestead credit, can mean different things for different people.
Yeah, it does.
Under income tax, we have proposed $2.4 million. Right. Does your department cost more than $2.4 million?
Probably around, it's right around there.
Because I would make the point that when cities incorporate, they instantly capture.
It's 2.5, it was right around there.
Okay. When cities incorporate and they capture the 17% income tax rate, that is essentially to pay the administrative overhead. So if you're near that rate, it's not like we're going to dump the administrative overhead by disincorporating because you'd lose the 17%. And I think the thing that we learned the thing that I learned in the TASD committee, and maybe Dan got something different out of it, but is that the things that we pay extra for in Tacoma Park, things that we don't get rebates for or don't get immediate rebates, a big correlation, are the things that are what people see as defining the city. So, there's the recreation department, and there's the library, and there's like half of the cost of the police department.
Correct.
And those are the big ticket items, and those are the things that people don't want to give up. I certainly don't want to give up our own police force, and recreation is, and being able to provide that for the kids at the 3 schools that are right here around us in particular, plus at the New Hampshire Avenue Recreation Center and other programs, is to a lot of people what makes Tacoma Park a great place to live. And I think people would make the same argument for the library. So it's hard to go back to the citizens, and that's a tough conversation, I will tell you.
But it's so hard to have that conversation like in a simple way because there's all these numbers that make it really hard.
Right, it is complex. And then the other comment that I wanted to make is that I think that September of 2008 was supposed to be the bottom of the housing market of the bubble, and now depending on where you live, it looks like it's second or third quarter of 2010 up to, in some places that are really bad off, the third quarter of 2011. Like, I wouldn't want to own a place in Miami or maybe Las Vegas right now. But I think what we're going to see next year is a great leveling, because all those people who bought at these really high prices, their mortgage isn't going to go down, but their assessment is. At the same time that people who have lived here for a long time, their assessments are going to be catching up at the 10% rate. And so we're going to get some leveling out, which will change that dynamic of having a tax change mean really different things for different people. And I know I talk a lot about coming from California, but on the block that I lived in where I grew up after Proposition 13, which limited the increase every year to 1.5%, you had these crazy factors where my parents paid $600 a year for their 4-bedroom home, and the people next door to us paid $6,000 a year in taxes. And I don't think it's that bad here, but there are some really wild discrepancies. And so I think one of the things that's going to happen next year is that we'll get more level assessments across the board, and it may actually make it easier to have the conversation about what a tax rate means. And I would agree that this year we should start preparing people for the idea that for the first time, it may not mean that the tax rate itself would drop, because next year it may be that the constant yield tax rate, I mean, if the assessments really drop a lot, the constant yield tax rate could be 65 cents instead of 55 cents or 57 cents, whatever it is now. And it's probably good to have that conversation so people start to understand that. But it could actually be some benefit to equity in the community to have that reassessment happen then, at the bottom of the market, if we're in the 2010 group.
What we have tried to do, and I'll take a look at how we have explained it, but as the individual departmental budgets come before the council, and we did this last year, is we try to call out how that particular department, if you will, is funded. So, for example, because Councilmember Clay just mentioned the library, we will call out the fact that the library generates $22,000 in fines and fees, and that we get a certain payment from the county, but that the net cost of having our own library is $858,000. And part of the reason why we try to do that, I think, is for the reasons you all are discussing, is just to share that information with the community, and at some point if the council chooses to have some sort of public engagement process, I think those are the discussions that, I'm not picking on the library, but I could take every single department, quite frankly, and we do that, to talk about what that net cost is, and I think that's a very valid community discussion to talk about, is it worth, X amount to have your own department, or to pay X amount to have a certain number of officers above what we're rebated from the county. And I think that should be a discussion that you have about each and every department in the city.
I see Councilmember Siemens and Councilmember Snipper have questions or comments, and then I'd like to try and let the city manager get through what she needs to get through with a little less commentary from us, and then we might kind of have questions at the end, but I want to give everybody a chance now and then see if we can move through it. So, Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll be very brief and kind of simple compared to some of the earlier discussions have been pretty complex. My reaction to the proposed budget is simply that I'm concerned to see that, as we did last year, we're talking about budgeting to spend more money than what our revenues are by about $2.5 million. That's my initial reaction, and that's all I'm prepared to talk about tonight. Thank you.
Councilmember Snipper.
No, I'll pass because I have a feeling you'll answer my question.
Okay. You want me to keep charging ahead then?
Yes, charge ahead.
I would just note, as I did last week, just for the benefit of anyone who wasn't listening at the meeting last week, it's just, Councilmember Siemens is correct that as you look at this from an accounting perspective, there is a $2.5 million difference between revenues and expenditures. I did just want to call out that a lot of what gets booked in the expenditures is the planned renovation of the Public Works facility, which, as I mentioned last week, would be paid for to a large extent with bond financing. Just from an accounting standpoint, that those bond proceeds are not counted as a revenue per se. They're counted what's kind of referred to as below the line, and that's another financing source. So just wanted to explain kind of how that's getting funded. Unless there's any other questions the council has about revenues, I was going to move on to expenditures. So I don't know, Councilmember Snipper, if your question was about expenditures or revenues, but I don't want to move on if you... Okay.
So just if I can ask you to kind of just say a little bit more about that last point that you just made, because I think it's important to understand that the $2.5 million difference is kind of before you get to the bottom of the accounting, so that there's other things that change that.
Yeah, the schedule that's before you basically mirrors the audit presentation, and that was something I started when I got here. So as someone tried to track from the audit to the budget, there was some correlation, and it didn't look all confusing and different to people as you try to track from one document to another. So what is before you on this summary is essentially the same accounting principle and layout that you see in your audited financial statements every year. Technically, things like bond proceeds, monies from a capital lease, when you have a lot of money coming from the sale of real property, such as when we sold the 2 properties on Piney Branch, in accordance with kind of generally accepted accounting principles, those are not really considered operating revenues. They're considered other financing sources, and they sort of come into play after you show the revenues and expenditures and essentially somewhat make up that shortfall, if you will. That's kind of what I meant by below the line, is because they technically literally do come below the line after you do that net difference between revenues and expenditures.
So that if we're looking on that general fund summary page, where you kind of really get to the total effect for the year is down at the bottom when you look at the fund balance from year to year.
Right.
That gets you
A little bit closer.
everything you need to know about kind of what's in the bank at the end of the year.
Correct, and we'll talk a little bit more about fund balance as we go on. Just in terms of expenditures, and I don't really want to get too detailed about any one department since you'll be kind of doing that over the next 30 days, but just really wanted to hit some key points, and much of this is a recap, as I mentioned, from last week, but I think it's important just to make sure we're all coming at it from the same standpoint. We are a service industry. Most of our expenses are tied to staffing. I think that's why we have been very judicious as an organization about not adding staff as a general principle. Our FTEs have remained relatively constant over the years because those costs tend to stay with you and they compound over time. As I mentioned last week, personnel costs in the budget are up by about $873,000. Some of that is certainly just straight increases of salaries from one year to the other. There are two things as we go through this budget process that we probably should spend some time talking about. One is our workers' compensation insurance. That is up by about $103,000. That's it is not necessarily reflective of a pattern of accidents, so certainly that's something that we try to watch. We had one particular employee, former employee, who had essentially a stroke while on duty several years ago, and basically under Maryland law, truthfully, whether or not it was necessarily caused by your job, Maryland law tends to be fairly liberal in terms of workers' compensation, and assumes that particularly for certain occupations that anything almost that happens while you're on duty essentially is deemed to be work-related. You see very similar laws across the country, for instance, in Massachusetts. Any kind of heart or lung condition for a police or fireman in the state of Massachusetts by their workers' comp laws is automatically deemed, regardless of smoking or family history, to be work-related. Maryland isn't probably quite that clear about it, but it's a fairly similar pattern to Massachusetts rather than some other states that tend to be more restrictive in how they view on-duty illnesses or injuries. So certainly that, doing as much prevention as we can in terms of workplace accidents and injuries has been a focus. It needs to continue to be a focus, but quite frankly, there's nothing we could have done in this particular instance that appears to be driving most of the increase that we'll see, unfortunately, for next year. The other thing that we talked about last year, we talked about a little bit already this budget season, is the police employees retirement plan. As I mentioned last week, we have been working very actively with the union over the past year to talk about what different plan options we have. And basically, we are seeing an increase in the rate recommended by the actuary for FY 2010, and that's primarily because we did not modify the plan before the current fiscal year started. There's a lag in terms of your actuarial rate. The pension board has recommended about a year ago a modified plan. We have essentially sat on that because we did have an obligation to meet with the union. And in talking to the actuary, my conversation with him was, what rate do you recommend? And he said, it's exactly the rate that's in the actuarial valuation that the council got. Certainly it's within the city's discretion, this council's discretion, not to choose to make a contribution at that 34.7% rate. I guess my own feeling is, to the extent that we can try to afford it, I don't think it's probably good financial sense in the long run to ignore what your actuary is telling you. We have essentially boiled down our options that we're talking to the union about to two. One is the modified version of the plan, which was recommended by the pension board and by our agreement with Local 400, which is the bargaining unit that represents most of our police officers. If the union and the city are unsuccessful in identifying another viable option, we essentially have concurrence by our union contract to bring that modified plan forward to the council for your consideration and hopefully approval. The other plan that we have looked at is a state plan, which is referred to as LEOPS. The rate for that plan for next year is set at about 30%. We did do a preliminary valuation, had the state do that for us. On the surface, it looked like we would potentially have a credit and that we would be able to buy into LEOPS at that 30% rate. The problem with the state plan is it will not take anyone who is already in pay status. So anybody who is retired or anyone who is on disability essentially becomes the city's financial responsibility to figure out how to continue those benefits. Unfortunately, we already have a disability problem. You don't shed that, quite frankly, by going to the state plan. We would continue to have an obligation, obviously, to provide benefits to those folks who are either retired or receiving disability payments. And essentially, by the time you factor in what that would likely cost, the contribution to the state plan, it essentially almost becomes an effective payroll contribution rate of about 46%. Yes, it almost gave me a heart attack too, Councilmember Snipper. So at this point, we met with the union last Monday. We'll probably continue to have probably one or two more discussions. But right now, my guess is that we should basically move forward with the modified plan as proposed by the pension board with the hope that that will curb some of the disability problem. But once you find yourself with that issue, truthfully, you're kind of stuck with it for some time to come. And that's simply the case that Tacoma Park finds itself in. As I mentioned last week, we do have a provision in our plan that does require annual medical certification for anyone who is on disability. So, we do that to make sure that someone is not drawing benefits who is no longer medically eligible for them. So we do have some of those provisions. I suspect that as we continue to try to grapple with this issue, that we'll continue to look at the plan and determine if there's any other changes that should be made, and we would certainly talk to the union about those. The other thing I think that we're going to see both with our plan and certainly with the state plan, and I've been trying to get information on this to better advise the council, while the rate for LEOPS is essentially 30%, their investments, I'm sure just like ours everyone's have sort of plummeted. And I have been attempting to get from the state what they would envision the rate for LEOPS to be going forward into FY 2011, because from my standpoint, that's part of my due diligence to this council, is to try to provide you with a longer range perspective. We've been unable to get that information. The state retirement office has a very limited staffing, and unfortunately the key staff person we were working with has had a very serious medical condition. So at this point, as I told the union last Monday, without having a clearer sense of what that move to the state plan might mean for the city in the long term, that my inclination was to advise this council to sort of stay put, kind of try to ride out having our own plan at least for another year until the picture at the state becomes a little clearer.
Did you say that their rate was going to decline?
No, I think it will go up.
Yeah.
It should go up considerably.
Because a lot of well, anyway, it's pretty typical that the rates are closer, follow the bond rates more than they follow the actual actuarial.
Right. So that's sort of the rather gloomy picture on the police employee retirement front. I wish I had better news for you, but it is what it is.
Isn't there some section that has good news?
Actually, the next one is probably going to be pretty much a downer as well. I'm sorry, Mayor Williams. And this is new information from last week, and it's not happy news. As I mentioned last week and in the transmittal message, when we were doing our personnel projections, we assumed that health insurance costs for employees would go up by 11%. And Ms. Hampton, our Human Resources Manager, had based that on some research she had done about kind of what trends are nationally. While I was off last week, we got our initial rate renewal from our health insurance carrier, which is 19.8%. That has an additional cost above and beyond the proposed budget that rate remains, and I'll talk about that a little bit more momentarily, of $102,000. So in the week since we basically gave you this budget, we've had the state essentially go after highway user revenues more to the tune, I believe, of almost $53,000 of lower revenues and a potential increased health insurance cost of $102,000. So to basically say, I feel like in the past week since I took a little bit of time off, the budget's sort of starting to fall apart, as I said to Jess and to Yvonda. We will be meeting with our broker on Wednesday to talk about health insurance. I would say it's very, very common with health insurance companies to get an extremely high rate, and then you become the negotiation process. Last year, we had a very high rate. What we were able to do is to bundle some other benefits under one carrier, our dental insurance, our life insurance, and to get that rate down. We will certainly be having our broker go back to our carrier and basically say that we, want them to try to sharpen their pencils and to work on this number. We will obviously also be talking about if there are some modifications to our benefit structure that we can make that would basically get this cost down. So I'm not suggesting at this point that, you need to go looking for $102,000. I'm just merely trying to tell you that this has been a variable that has changed since a week ago, and what we are doing to work on it.
Is there anything that you would say that would characterize the health insurance that the city offers?
In terms of how I would characterize the plan design, I would say it's very rich. As I shared with you, you were in earlier today, and, I've been fortunate enough in my career to work in cities that I think have had, very generous health insurance benefits, and I would say when I came to Tacoma Park, and we haven't changed the plan design since I got here, I was somewhat surprised at the benefit structure. I think there are some things that we do need to look at with our broker in terms of co-pays. I know over my years in government, it's amazing sometimes what tweaking, prescription drug co-pays by $5 or something can have a tremendous impact on what your rates are. So those are certainly discussions that we'll be having later this week. So I think it'll be an issue that we need to come back to you probably towards the end of the budget process. But as we get more information, we'll certainly be sharing that with you.
And if there were any changes in that area, is that something that would need to be negotiated with the unions, or is that something that the city just does?
That's a good question. I'd like to talk to, Suzanne was off today, I'd like to talk to her about it. I think obviously there can always be looking at a contract and be differing interpretations of language. And I think certainly that's something that we would be sharing, and talking to the unions about once we have some information. But there might be different interpretations about what the contract requires. I would hope, as we talk about these things with our workforce, certainly I think the city has always put a high value on its employees, as I do. I think that as a workforce, we all need to look about what's happening in the economy in general and recognize that I don't think that we can expect the taxpayers of this community to be the only ones taking hits. I think employees are going to need to look at the benefits that we all receive. Thankfully, we're not experiencing the kind of layoffs and things that many other jurisdictions are, and I know everyone's grateful for that. After that downer news, the rest of this should probably be very boring for the council. I'm sorry, Councilmember Wright.
Sorry, are you continuing to go through expenditures, or are we done with expenditures?
I was going to go through and just make a very quick few points. No, that's fine. As you go through the individual departmental budgets, and this is, like I say, a very high-level picture, you'll see very minimal changes in supplies, and some of this is a recap from the transmittal message. Truthfully, supplies overall in the city, and by supplies I mean just sort of those category of expenditures, we're down overall by about $40,000 across the entire general fund. Most of that decrease was simply sort of a reallocation of how something was handled. If you may recall, the police department switched to new uniforms during this fiscal year. Since we were actually purchasing an outlay of uniforms, their clothing allowance was down for FY09 after that initial outfitting essentially supplies went down, but their clothing allowance amount went up. So services and charges, this is where you'll see things that are classified such as contract, and mostly a lot of contract type of spending. Those costs overall throughout the general fund are down by about $139,000. A couple reasons for that. One is the current year budget includes funding for Safe Tacoma, which lapses as of June 30th. We are actually seeing a reduced cost for our contract with the county for inspection of rental properties. That cost will actually go down next year. In FY 2010, we will not have any expenses related to the temporary day laborer site as we have had in prior years. The current year budget includes $25,000 in funding for the Crossroads Farmers Market. The proposed budget includes $10,000. That was a figure that Sarah Daines had talked to John Hyde about before his untimely passing. I think that's something that as we go through the budget, given we'll need to really look at the status of the Crossroads Farmers Market and truthfully what its viability is in the wake of Mr. Hyde's passing. I mean, he was such a critical part of that. And Sarah and I have had some discussions about what type of help we might be able to provide. So I think that'll be a subject you may want to talk to Sarah about when you meet with her.
I have one quick question on the inspections. Do I understand it that all the housing units in Tacoma Park are inspected each year?
There's kind of two ways to answer that. We contract with the county for inspections of rental properties, and those are inspected on an annual basis. The reason that we pay the county for that service is because, from a county perspective, they inspect rental properties once every 3 years. So we are essentially paying the county for a higher level of service than they provide in other parts of the county.
So do we have any control over that? And I've refreshed my memory on how much we pay the county for that yearly inspection.
I'll look the number up to be sure. Yvonne might be able to help me up as I'm talking. It's roughly about $180,000.
Do we have any control over how often did we specifically ask them to inspect our properties
Yes.
on a yearly basis?
Right.
And what was the rationale for a yearly inspection as opposed to the norm in the county for every 3 years?
This predates my tenure with the city. My understanding is that it came out of a concern about the age of the city's housing stock, its rental properties, and wanting to make sure from a safety standpoint that there was just a feeling on the part of the city that annual inspections were needed.
I see. So that 100, let's say it's 180,000. It's 90,000. It's 90,000 for the first additional year, and another 90,000 for the second additional year. And maybe that's. And do we have any flexibility?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think as you talk about what is the level of service that you want to provide in the community, I think this is, truthfully, we had some email exchanges, earlier this year, and this was one of the ones I highlighted in those exchanges with the council. The city council could choose that once every 3 years is an acceptable level of inspection, and if we wanted to make that change, then essentially there would be no payment to the county required. Okay. Because we would just be treated like any other jurisdiction and receive inspections once every 3 years. And certainly the county does go in and do inspections on a complaint basis.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Inspections of, in terms of your other question, inspections of properties that are non-rental, we do not do any interior inspections. It's basically property maintenance enforcement on the outside.
Okay.
And if I
Which
can
we
just
handle
add
ourselves.
to that, I was thinking about Councilmember Robinson's characterization of 90,000 buys the second year and 90,000 buys the third year. I think it's more than that, since over the 3 years we're paying 180, 180, 180.
Oh, it's 180 per year.
Per year.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure,
And,
sure.
and
Of
therefore,
course.
if we said no only every 3 years and we don't pay anything,
Correct.
the actual cost is
Right, zero
Correct.
versus
500,000 and some or something, 550 or something like that.
right.
Got it. Thank you for that clarification, Mayor Williams.
Any questions? Yeah, I guess just a few other comments just overall about expenditures. We have a classification of expenditures that is known as miscellaneous. generally this is going to be things that don't fit neatly into certain categories. Some of them, quite frankly, are somewhat unfortunate that they were set up in the account structure many, many years ago as miscellaneous, such as the tipping fees we pay for refuse collection. They were set up as miscellaneous expenditures, and so we've continued that practice just for tracking purposes. Miscellaneous expenses overall are down by about $288,000. The reasons for that is in the Housing and Community Development Department budget this year, there was $100,000 that was budgeted for kind of unspecified, undesignated affordable housing initiatives. Not to say a lot has happened with that, mainly because we need to bring back the affordable housing policy to the council for your review and for you to make a determination of what funding you want going where. As I was working with Sarah on the Housing and Community Development Department budget this year, I reduced that $100,000 to $50,000 for next year, I think for two reasons. One is there's still not a very specified program, and I was a little concerned about tying up that much money in what was going to be a tough fiscal year. I think the other part is the city has certainly made a pretty significant financial contribution to preserving affordable housing just through the number of pilot agreements that you all have authorized. The other thing that's happening, I guess, in the expenses that are categorized as miscellaneous is our costs for debt service have gone down, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, and we have a number of one-time grants in the current year budget that do not carry over into next year, and we'll talk about that under the non-departmental section.
I'm sorry, I must be missing where the miscellaneous is in the expenditure in the general fund summary.
It's in every single departmental budget. What you'll see as you go through each departmental budget is, just from an accounting standpoint, expenditures are classified essentially in 5 ways. It's either going to be personnel cost, supply cost, services and charges, miscellaneous, or capital, you'll see. Of the ones I just mentioned, Councilmember Robinson, the affordable housing issue falls into the Housing and Community Development Department. Lower cost for debt service falls into debt service, obviously. And the one-time grants that I alluded to generally fall into the non-departmental, which we'll be talking about later this evening, very briefly. It's getting
Did you
late.
have something, John?
I just was curious, on the debt service side, is that going down because, we're getting less income on our money? Are we refinancing any of the debt? Or?
The debt service basically went down for pretty much one reason I guess two reasons, from 09 to 010. One is, for those who have been on the council or in the community for a while, when unification occurred, there were a number of improvements made in the Pinecrest area. And essentially the way that was handled was a payment to Montgomery County kind of amortized over several years. So the payment, for example, this year was $55,000, and essentially it was kind of a withholding from our tax duplication payments.
Yeah, it was part grant and part loan at 0%.
Zero interest. We made the last installment payment, if you will, on that, what I refer to as the Pinecrest loan this fiscal year. So that $55,000 doesn't show up as an expenditure in 2010. We also had a capital lease for some police radio equipment, and Yvonne might have to help me out here, but I think that payment fell from 09 to 2010 by about $40,000. Does that sound about right?
It went from 47 down to 15.
Okay. So a little bit more than
And that Pinecrest pot of money was essentially to do infrastructure repairs to streets, sidewalks, curbs and gutters.
Right. It was mainly road related.
And it was in the area between Elm, Ethan Allen, Eastern, and New Hampshire.
Is there not any opportunity to refinance at lower finance rates?
We can certainly kind of look into that. There may be some opportunities to do that. Probably one of the things which doesn't really show up in debt service per se, that we probably have had more internal discussions about, and we'll probably get to that when we get to non-departmental, but on the state retirement plan for civilian employees. When the city went into that plan many, many years ago, we have our payments that are set by the actuarial rate that the state establishes every year. But essentially, instead of having a credit when the city bought into the state plan, we had a debit, if you will, which is some debt that's being amortized over 40 years. It shows up in the non-departmental budget as a payment of about $75,000 every year. That actually has a fairly high rate, and Yvonne and I have had some internal discussions about trying to essentially pay that off, because we're essentially paying a very high rate to the state. And we probably need to try to see if we can get that paid off at a much lower rate. Might not be an initial one-year savings, but over time, it will save the city probably a boatload of money if we're able to do that.
And then only other comment I have on expenditures, I think as the departments come forward for their sessions, I think two reminders. One would be what we found helpful last year when, particularly, the example I think we'd cite was the community development department. But then also, as you look at these costs, a big chunk is in personnel. Unless we're going to tell you that we want you to cut somebody, that is not going to happen. Nothing's going to happen there. So I would expect that when they come forward, that we have some good level of detail around the miscellaneous and service charges.
Sure.
Again, I don't want to look at pencils, but just more.
You want to know where most of the
buckets,
item is.
So if there are things that we're going to recommend to cut.
The other way to cut, as the city manager's pointed out, is to have furloughs if we get to that point, instead of cutting a position, staff
Yeah,
position.
I mean, that was my other question to ask, is that at the county, a lot of the big unions have basically taken no pay increases. I think in total, the number we've heard from the county council is it accounts for $125 million.
Correct.
And so, in place of having, so they cut fewer people and people retain their jobs, and then there's furlough, so I would want to understand what those options are.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. We certainly had some discussions as I was meeting with the staff about preparing their budget, and everybody, I think, was keenly aware of what's happening around us, and it was interesting the number of department heads who actually came to me and said if we get to the point that you would be looking at recommending layoffs of city staff, could you explore furloughs? And I guess my comment to the management team, and I guess my comment to the council, I think furloughs can work if you're trying to get through kind of a temporary adjustment period. If there's something that you're just trying, it's kind of almost viewed as a one-time kind of thing. I guess my own feeling is that furloughs tend to be a bit of a gimmick if you have an underlying structural problem that you need to fix. So I view furloughs as sort of a one-year thing to give you an opportunity to talk to the community about what services are important to it, what it's willing to pay for. But I would be very hesitant as your city manager to say do furloughs every single year, because I think it's just an avoidance of a problem that we may need to deal with. I guess just the only other thing I was going to say about just overall expenditures, and you can certainly see it on the page in front of you, is obviously there's a big jump in capital expenditures. They're up by $1.1 million. Basically, I think the reason for this is pretty self-evident. It's the planned renovation of the Public Works facility is what you're seeing there. Unless there's any...
Can you just say something that I didn't spend a lot of time trying to figure it out, but it struck me at one point that if we were thinking about a potentially $2 million project for the Public Works facility, and there's bond proceeds of 1.5, are we financing the other 5?
My recommendation is to try to minimize interest costs, and I think we do have kind of fund balance beyond what we need to. My own preference, and I guess my recommendation to the council, is when you have excess fund balance that can accumulate for a lot of reasons, using it for sort of non-recurring one-time expenditures is appropriate, not to dig into your fund balance to fund operations that you simply can't afford. Is my recommendation is that, Yvonne and I have talked about it, that we think there would be appropriate to maybe use $500,000 in accumulated fund balance to essentially minimize the debt that we would incur for the Public Works facility. So,
What did I see? I saw this fund balance was $750 or $5 million. Now I forgot.
yeah, I was ready to move on to fund balance if the council
Oh,
is.
that's
So
right.
that was a really
Okay.
good segue. So if you're okay with that, if you go back just one page from where we've been talking about, I kind of wanted to spend a little bit of time on fund balance, and I am cognizant that it's getting late.
Which page are we now on?
You're one page back from where you were. So if you
Well,
just
but that's assuming we were all in the same place.
Okay, if you were on the general fund summary, just flip back one more. It's,
Fourth page, it says general fund.
it's entitled General Fund Fund Balance Projection Detail.
Oh, see, I wasn't in the same place.
Shame.
You were on general fund revenues?
Well, we kind of flipped because there were more detailed questions about revenues. I guess just very quickly, and just to make sure everyone's on the same page about kind of what exactly is fund balance. And it's essentially kind of an accounting ease definition, but I don't know any other way to explain it. It's essentially the accumulation of the difference between actual revenues and expenditures that basically accumulate over a period of time. What you will see is, from community to community, is the percentage of the fund balance that you have or you think you should have really can vary from community to community. It's very much tied to the source of your revenues, how stable those are, when you get your money in, because quite often, particularly with property taxes, for instance, most of the money comes in from November to January. If you tend to have a lot of expenditures that, are front-loaded, you need to essentially have reserve cash, if you will, until your bank account gets replenished. The community that I was in before Tacoma Park was, in Missouri, property taxes tend to be the purview of the school district, so you had municipalities basically relying on sales taxes and taxes on utilities, all of which could be very variable. So we had a fund balance policy that actually required the city manager, it was something I put in while I was there, that requires city managers to basically present budgets that maintain an unrestricted fund balance of 20% of expenditures by year end. And that was because we had 3 major businesses that if any one of them shut down, our sales taxes would tank. You didn't really control what happened with utilities in terms of revenues, but we got virtually almost no money from property taxes. So that's why you'll see a lot of differences. So I think the more stable your revenue sources are, the lower your fund balance can probably be safely.
And yet 20% of our 20 million would be 4 million, and
right.
As of June 30th, we have 8 million.
So right, and
40%.
Right, and I think that's
No, that's unreserved.
Yeah, it's unreserved, and I think that's one of the things that isn't unique to Tacoma Park, but I guess just to touch on, and you're giving me all sorts of great segues tonight, Councilmember Robbins. Thank you. The city's fund balance is actually comprised of a couple components. In accordance with the charter, and this goes back a number of years ago, Mayor Williams might be able to help me out, but the city essentially set up an emergency reserve fund, which started out with sort of an initial outlay of $250,000. Basically, it has interest earnings that have accumulated over many years, and we don't put money into that. The charter has very clear guidelines about what is required to withdraw money from the emergency reserve, the purposes for which it can be used, and it does require very definitive council action to do that. So if you're looking at the sheet in front of you, basically, as of June 30th of 2010, which would be the end of the next fiscal year, we're projecting that the emergency reserve will roughly be about $362,000. So this is considered a restricted part of your fund balance because it's set aside for very specific purposes. It really only goes up through its interest earnings investment. It does accrue some investment. We don't show additions to that because it's basically done at year end. But there will be investment earnings that are tied specifically to that pot of money, and this gets reported in your audit report every single year, what the balance of that is.
But it's so why doesn't it
Because essentially the investment calculation is done at year end. It's done as part of the audit prep work.
So it can go up from 2008 either?
The numbers that are as of July 1st, 2008 are the numbers taken directly from the audit report. As I mentioned, the only thing that would happen with this money would be investment earnings. There is no allocation every year.
We haven't gotten to June 30th, 2009.
Right, we haven't gotten to 2009 yet.
That is based on an annual index.
Right, okay.
Right.
Increase.
Right.
And if I can just add, I think the last time that was gone into was for the Bobcat in the big snowstorm about 10 years ago when we couldn't clear the snow out of town and we needed something to lift it and to dump it over and I think put it in the creek and all kinds of things we weren't supposed to do just because we had nowhere to put the snow and we needed something to scoop it up. And within a week or two, we had to make that acquisition and how were we going to do it? And there was one available, and if we didn't want it, somebody else had it.
The Bobcat strategy.
Yep. And that Bobcat, we don't even own anymore.
He was retired this year, wasn't he?
Yeah.
The good old Bob. Did it have a name?
Bob.
If we can go back for a moment to the bond that you've mentioned a couple of times for the public works renovation, I wonder if you would characterize that as a loan or as a grant?
Bond proceeds are clearly debt. It's like a mortgage on your house. You're paying it off, so there's no way it's a grant.
Thank you.
Like many organizations, Tacoma Park has an equipment replacement reserve. The name's kind of self-explanatory. People call them different things but most financially solid municipalities, at least in my opinion, do have some sort of mechanism. They call it different things, but essentially to set aside money for the future replacement of equipment. Because certainly if you have a very expensive piece of equipment, it's much easier to kind of save for it over a period of time than it is to see a lot of ups and down cycles and as it hits your revenues. In Tacoma Park, we refer to that as the Equipment Replacement Reserve. It is also referenced in the charter. As I mentioned last week, what we try to do, we for transparency purposes, we budget the contribution to the Equipment Replacement Reserve as an expenditure. And that's strictly done so that we're being very clear with the community about what we're doing. It is actually really not, I guess, an expenditure. It's merely an allocation from unrestricted fund balance to restricted. But I feel like it's important to show this in some way. The downside of doing it this way, quite honestly, is you see it budgeted as an expenditure item, and then, of course, since it isn't really an expenditure, when you get your audit report every year, it shows as a big old variance, which makes it look like we don't know what we're doing. But the reason we do it is just strictly for transparency purposes. If you look at that line on this page, it shows an addition in fiscal year '09 of $500,000, which is what's included in the current year budget. You'll see deletions of $500 and almost $27,000. That's the amount of equipment that we were actually purchasing. So we're actually going into the hole as of June 30th of 2009. Last year we talked about this a lot. I went back and looked at the years prior to my coming to the city to kind of see what had happened with the contributions to the Equipment Replacement Reserve, and quite frankly what I saw is many years, and I can't explain it, those of you who were on the council might be able to, but many years in which no contribution was made, years in which...
That's how we balance the budget.
Right. Years in which there was certainly a whole lot more money going out than was going in. Certainly this is something that I think is discretionary on the part of the council. I think, in my mind, not setting aside at least a halfway decent amount is sort of the equivalent of not maintaining your streets or deferring capital. It always does catch up with you at some point. As I mentioned last week, when Daryl ran all the calculations, and she goes out to like 2030 in this program, the ideal funding level would be about $1.5 million a year. Quite frankly, in kind of tough economic times and trying to balance, what taxpayers are paying, I think there needs to be at least some balance between what we're contributing and what is the ideal amount. Life isn't always ideal, so I settled on $750,000. I think it's a good compromise given kind of what the other needs are and the concerns of residents about what they're paying in property taxes. But I did want to disclose it's not the ideal amount, but I do think it's a very good faith effort to do what we need to do to budget for future capital acquisition.
There was, some years ago, there was a good bit of discussion about how much to put in yearly for street repair. It was $500,000 was the number that was agreed upon.
Correct.
Is that in here?
It really isn't. That's really not considered equipment. What we are doing currently, and in your recollection, Councilmember Robinson is correct, this was happening, I guess, a decision of the council right before I joined the city staff. What you will see is right now we do essentially have, in kind of an abstract way, $500,000 for street repair. You've got an outright allocation And then you have a debt service payment on the bonds that the city took out. I guess it was fiscal year '05, because that was the year I started. You had just adopted the budget when I...
So that's not a fund balance, that's in a
It's
different
really,
category.
yeah, you'll see part of it is in the CIP, it's in capital outlay in the general fund, and then the debt payment on the bonds that the city took out in FY '05 will show up in debt service. The next line down is the WSSC contribution. We already talked about a little bit. This was Councilmember Robinson's question about what's going on with services and charges. As you'll see, we started this year with just about $43,000 in money that was set aside for future street repairs. We're expecting to get $220,000 from WSSC, and next year we're not expecting to get anything. What you'll see is those funds being withdrawn from that sort of set-aside allocation as those streets come up for repair. So basically, if you kind of follow this down, you've got about almost $2.2 million of the projected fund balance as of June 30th, 2010 that would be considered restricted in some way. And that basically accounts for, let's see, I did my little math here, about 32% of where we think we'll end up with our fund balance as of June 30th of 2010.
If I can just make a quick comment on the WSSC contribution. As we've had discussions with folks about how streets get left, and we know that there are payments on some streets, not on others, and that if there were ever any discussion about trying to accelerate the potential mill and overlay of streets that have WSSC work, where we have that money from them set aside.
You're being timed out yourself.
Thank you, Mayor.
Then we would have this money in this fund to be pulled, but we essentially don't have the money in what we have budgeted or have laid out in future budgets
Right.
to match that, to accelerate that.
Correct. We would need to allocate more than the $500,000 that Councilmember Robinson was just alluding to. Exactly. Basically, like I say, that's sort of the fund balance in a nutshell.
Maybe you covered this before, but I see that in the unreserved fund balance, $1.5 million comes out.
Right.
And was that $500,000 to buy down the $2 million for the public works?
Yeah.
Plus another $1 million for something that I...
No, it's a very good question. I'm sorry, Councilmember Robinson, I should have addressed that. It's really kind of a function of two things. When you see that deletion column, and I think you're referring to kind of the $1.56 million that's supposed to happen next fiscal year, it's a function of two things. One is the $750,000 that is moving from the unreserved fund balance to the equipment replacement reserve. That's that reallocation I told you. That's
okay.
The other portion of that is what we would be paying towards the Public Works facility, at least as proposed in cash. And that actually adds up to about $757,000. About $500,000 of that is what we anticipate would be towards construction. The other $257,000 would be for design-related work or construction administration services from the architect. So in total, what is proposed to be paid for out of cash for the Public Works facility is $757,000.
Which means that the total project would be anticipated to be about 2.25 rather than 2.
Yeah, it's probably actually a little bit closer to 2.3 because we're expecting to spend probably anywhere from $40,000 to $60,000 in Phase 1 design services this year. This was the contract you approved, I guess it was last week.
Yeah, last week. We saw that figure. We saw the 250 or the 300 last week.
Right.
So that means we're not dipping into the unreserved fund balance to fund ongoing operations.
Correct. It would basically be used for primarily the Public Works project.
I just have one last quick question about expenditures. So
Sure.
some of the reason that fund balance is big is because, if you look at adopted FY09 versus estimated FY09, and you look at the total expenditures, but even if you look basically department by department, every single one of them comes in under budget.
Yeah, I
So
mean,
I appreciate that.
There's a cost to doing that, though. I mean, yeah, I think you're right. I think one of the things that Yvonne and I have looked at and talked about, and I think it may be something the council wants to consider, is when we put together a budget, probably the biggest cost that we, need to consider and talk about is what happens with staffing. And so we budget as if all positions are going to be filled for the entire fiscal year. I would say that often doesn't happen. I mean, it's very unlikely that every single department will be fully staffed. I worked in one organization when I first started. I was, my second job with the City of Kansas City was as a budget analyst, and one of my departments was the police department. Kansas City at that time had a police force of approaching 2,000 officers. And truthfully, they could never get enough recruits to even staff every single academy class. So as a matter of course, given the scale of that organization, we budgeted what I refer to as salary savings. That was the practice there, and essentially we assumed that the Kansas City Police Department would not be at full staffing, and I actually did all their personnel calculations and took a certain amount off the top. That works very well when you have an organization that large and you pretty much have a good sense of history. I'm not saying, I would say that the fact that we budget assuming full staffing is certainly a conservative approach. I think the council could say that's too conservative and make a decision that you want to, back off that approach. We could certainly look at that. I don't know that I have a good enough sense of where I think those vacancies are going to occur.
Well, we did that in the police force.
Yeah, we funded 41 instead of 42 one year, even though it was authorized.
Right. What we have done this year, and we did it for the current year, and I have repeated that, is we still are at 42. The council may want to override me on this. At this point, I don't necessarily have a reason to think anyone is leaving or retiring, so we have funded again for 42. I have shared with the chief that my recommendation to the council would be that if, let's just say during this budget process, we were to get an officer submit a resignation or to, a notice of retirement, that my recommendation to the council is that at the earliest opportunity, we take the department back to 41.
I would just say that I appreciate the conservative approach of budgeting for full staffing, as long as the department heads don't have a use it or lose it attitude. That they have to use the money that's in their budget before year end.
No, they do not.
I like the conservative approach. I prefer to have the surprises in that direction than the other direction. But it is this funny thing where that allows us to build our reserve, right? Which we say is based on funding, that this is really to fund ongoing operations, but then we build a reserve and we use it for one-time expenditures.
Right.
So it's kind of a year to year. If you look at any one year, you don't see it, but when you start to look at it year over year,
you do.
You do sort of then realize what's going on. And if we're trying to stick true to the using current income taxes or current revenues to fund current operations, then it gets a little bit funny.
And if I can just add, that's where the origin of the equipment replacement reserve came from. That in 1990, whatever the budget was that year, they said, "Oh, we got $1 million fund balance. That we've got $1 million extra in fund balance, and it should go to ongoing things." So it went back into setting up that capital.
Yeah, I think one of the things certainly we need to do as a staff is basically, and we do. We've had, we have a new finance budget specialist who came on board. I believe it was in August, and one of the things I had her do was to go back through once we got the audited numbers, and I think we got to go back 2 years, truthfully to sort of look at what the departments themselves had projected out for the fiscal year and how close they actually came to being right on target. Truthfully, I think part of what every manager needs to do is to basically look at what he or she is projecting and how close they hit the mark, quite frankly, because if they're overestimating what they're going to spend by the end of the year and that doesn't come true, then I've underestimated the fund balance, and that's part of what I use to guide my recommended budget and my guidance to the council. So I think it's certainly a matter of going back and trying to figure out how we did our projections, how close we came, if we didn't hit them, why, and trying to use that information to be better at it. I would say probably over the last few years since Shavonda has been, and I have both been here, we're only about, I guess, 6 months or so apart in terms of our tenure with the city. Probably the biggest thing that we have worked on the revenue side of things, because it's not just expenditures, it's the revenue side, has been income taxes. And I know when I came here, going back and looking at history of projections done for income taxes, and I will say every organization struggles with it. You know, there's years that you can be off because we'll get this payment from the state, in July or August, this oddball payment that comes in actually after the fiscal year has ended and it gets accrued back, and there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to it. And I know when Yvonne got here, something she and I talked about, and I had gone out and looked at some other cities' budgets to say, well, you know, how are they doing it? And what I found is that some of the larger municipalities in Montgomery County could actually be off by $1.5 million on their one income source. So I figured there wasn't much guidance coming from those cities. So that's where we kind of hooked up with the chief economist in Montgomery County, and Yvonne has cultivated a relationship with someone at the state that we try to talk to. So it's truthfully just a continual process of trying to refine our projections and our estimates and trying to come as close as we can. I would say income taxes has been an area, you know, like this year, for example, when we were doing, putting together the current year budget, every indication was from MML and talking to all these other jurisdictions is, oh my gosh, the state has increased the personal income tax exemption, everything's going to fall off. And so we were very conservative this year. If you look at our projections compared to the budget this year, that doesn't seem to be holding true for Tacoma Park. We're not seeing the decline in income tax revenues that everyone a year ago was saying would happen. So we'll probably see almost $300,000 or more from that revenue source coming in over budget. So we try to come close, but we're not perfect either.
I mean, I guess the only other thing to think about is whether we create a capital fund reserve, right? Because, I mean, I haven't been on that long to know, Bruce might know better than I do, but for example, what are we looking to dip into the fund for? A capital project of a building, right? So we have equipment reserve, but we don't have facility reserve in any way, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and Yolanda and I have had some discussions about that. I think that is a very good comment, Councilmember Wright. I mean, eventually, as I mentioned in last year's budget message, and I didn't repeat it this year, but you know, there's going to come a point in time where we need to be doing some significant renovation work, perhaps to the library. I mean, it is one of the city facilities that nothing has been done for a while, and we need to start trying to put together some mechanism to prepare for that, whenever that might occur.
We're working on one of the walls right now.
Exactly, and Ellen's very appreciative of that. She told me that today. You know, I think one of the other things, which is, I don't want to really get into this evening, and it's probably a discussion after the budget process, the charter provides for two, essentially, contingency accounts. One is the general contingency account, which is 0.5% of revenues, and the charter is very clear, in my opinion, that that is budgeted as an expenditure, and it shows up in the non-departmental budgetary unit. The unappropriated reserve, by practice, it's 2% of revenues, and that has been budgeted. Yvonne and I have had this discussion, probably going back, a couple years now. That's been the practice. I've continued it. I think when you literally look at the charter, I'm not sure that it requires that 2% to be budgeted. And I do think that a better way of handling your reserve funds is tying it to your expenditures, not your revenues. So I think at some point after this budget process, I think the way the city handles a lot of its reserve accounts and what those financial policies are is probably something I would like to talk to the council about and get a sense of, you know, whether you're comfortable with where we're at or if some modification is needed. But when you look at the unappropriated reserve, which we typically, you know, and I think a good thing is not to spend it every year, but we're essentially setting aside a pretty significant amount of money, which I think has been more of a practice than a requirement. But you have to show it as being expended for the purposes of calculating fund balance, and I think that has certain consequences to it. This council has not done it, but I think when you set aside that amount of money, I think a less financially responsible council may think, well, it's there, therefore we can draw on it. And I think transferring money out of an account in a budget is almost an easier financial exercise than saying you have to dig into your unrestricted fund balance and bump up your overall expenditure. So it's not been a problem with any of the councils I've worked with here, but I think in a less financially responsible climate, it can encourage spending that may not be the wisest thing to do.
On this exact front, I have a concern with the size of whether it's the unappropriated reserve or whether it's the unreserved fund balance. A little, perhaps, clarity would help. You need a pot of money because, as you were indicating, the expenditures and revenues aren't even during the course of the year, and so you have to have a little history as to how that spend-out occurred of expenditures and how the revenue flows came in. And I assume that's what you have. And so then the question is, how much more beyond that minimum amount are you keeping?
I would probably, Yvonne basically directly handles the cash. And we've talked about your comfort level, where you think the unrestricted fund balance should be. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? I think that's your question, isn't it? What is that number?
I think it should be at least 25% of the expenditures. And that would be somewhere, like between $3 and $4 million.
Okay, so we're at 4.6 at the end
Also looking
at the end of the year.
Bad economy coming up too. So.
Yeah, that's I want to know what the reality is. So.
But that's one of the indications of
end of the year
being
number.
a solvent organization too, is the amount of unrestricted fund balance.
Right.
As a ratio of your total expenditures.
Right. Exactly. And that's where I was going.
Yeah.
That was my next question. Ratio of the unrestricted fund balance to your expenditures. Do you have the percentage? Or do I have to check that?
Has it. Okay.
It's, is it?
And I would probably back off the cap.
4.6 divided by the 23 million or something like that.
Yeah, I think I would probably back off the capital, because some of the capital is
Yeah.
sort of a one-time
Well, that's
thing.
right. You need somebody to do it right. Because that's something that concerned me last year as well, but I didn't really know how to bring it into the discussion, because it seems like we have a pretty large cushion.
Yeah, I think if
When
you...
it comes to the question we were having before of shouldn't we then adjust our revenues or expenditures, spend the money I'm uncomfortable with always underspending the budget myself for some of the reasons that we were discussing earlier, but this is, it's all kind of related to each other.
Yeah, it is. I think if you just look at the prior page, the general fund summary, and to ballpark it, Councilmember Snipper, and we can certainly do a little bit more detailed analysis for you. I just backed off the capital. And I think if you take off the capital, you're left with 20 million. 25% is, Yvonne is probably more conservative than I am. I think that's a pretty high number, but if you just take 25% of 20 million, that would be 5. I think this is a discussion, I think that when Councilmember Elridge was on the council, a few budgets I did with him, we would go back and forth on this every year, and I have other council members, and it's a good question. I think
That's why having the spend out and flows would be helpful, because then you can see, does that low point happen once a year, or does it happen several times during the year? If it happens once a year, it's much easier to predict. If it happens several times, it's harder to predict. There's all kinds of these sorts of considerations which go into it, and I'm sure there are guidelines from
it's
MML about what the percentage should be and so on.
Yeah, and I would probably say it's sort of what we talked about. It's really going to vary from community to community. I have probably seen it generally be anywhere between 10 and 20% of your expenditures. And by expenditures, it's usually non-capital because of just the non-recurring nature of much of your capital. I would say as a more good or bad, a more property tax dependent community, typically property taxes tend to be more stable than many other revenue sources. I think your cash flow needs, even in the short time that I've been with the city, when I first came here and we were truthfully doling out money, advancing money for the community center construction, since a lot of that was, either state bond financed or federal grants, the city had to front all that. So I know when Yvonne first started, she's cringing right now. She's cringing about this. We literally had times that we were staggering payments that we were making for that reason. So it's not a simple answer, but we can certainly try to do a little bit more analysis. I mean, I think the age-old question of fund balance is you need to make sure you have enough, cash to get through those timing differences. But I think kind of the subtext, of what we're all talking about is there becomes a point where if you don't have a specific purpose for what you're using it for, then essentially it is holding, in my mind, taxpayer money when you shouldn't be. It's hard to look at it just on the books without knowing. One of the communities I worked in as an assistant manager, we were going to do pretty much build or renovate all of our city facilities. It was a massive capital project. We deliberately stockpiled money for a number of years because we wanted to pay for about half of that by cash. But we were able to say to taxpayers, this is why we have a high fund balance and this is what we intend to do with it.
Right. That's the capital reserve.
Right.
There's another point in this that comes about in this discussion, I think. City Manager Matthews, have you worked in cities, or do you have knowledge of cities that take a little bit more entrepreneurial approach and acquire distressed properties and fix them up and then put them back on the market, for example, and take the difference between the cost and the fix-up value and put that back into the as a revenue source?
It's a redevelopment agency.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's really more.
Some cities do that, don't
It's more of a redevelopment agency. You typically see it tied more to housing authorities, I think is probably the most common one. And I say this somewhat facetiously, Councilmember Robinson, but if you look at the restrictions that are placed on governmental entities in terms of their investments, cities are not allowed, nor state governments, to go out and essentially play the stock market. And I think to some degree doing real estate speculation usually is very limited, and it usually has to do with, as Councilmember Clay was saying, redevelopment authorities or housing authorities, and they're typically done not necessarily to be entrepreneurial and try to flip real estate. It's done typically in blighted areas or something where you're doing redevelopment. They're land trusts.
Right. Well, the Langley Park area, if the Purple Line comes in, and they're considering some very large improvements or increases in the property values over there. I don't know if that, mostly not in our part of the city.
Yeah.
But out in unincorporated Prince George's, there's going to be some major changes over there.
What I would say I have seen, and I don't think that it was, I hesitate to even bring this up, what I have seen cities probably tend to do is when you, and I've been a part of this myself, is when you see a local government essentially working in partnership with a private developer, essentially when you're doing large-scale redevelopment projects, and where the governmental entity tends to come in, and there's very differing opinions about this, is if a private developer, you go through an RFP process, you know what you want to happen with an area, cannot acquire the property voluntarily, then you see a governmental entity essentially exercising their power of eminent domain on behalf of a developer, essentially because that development wouldn't happen. I have seen that happen in a number of cities that I have worked in and have been part of those.
Well, I'm thinking around we are so dependent on property taxes, and the other sources of income for us are so restricted and are shrinking.
Right.
What do you do? I'm kind of casting out there what other options are there, and I understand the difficulties and the risks of being a little more entrepreneurial, and yet I think it's worth exploring and discussing to some extent.
What I have been a part of and what I have seen cities that I have worked in, and certainly I've been fortunate enough to have worked probably in states that are not as restrictive as Maryland in terms of what you can do. I worked in one community where we essentially contracted out our services to another small municipality. We provided their building inspection services, their fire, their police, and they paid us for that. We constructed joint facilities with 2 other municipalities. We constructed an aquatic center. It was on our property. We were essentially the primary managing entity, but other cities contributed to the capital cost and its ongoing operation. So those are the kind of things that I've seen.
Thank you.
That's, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I see a clear divide on the dais here. I see this end, papers gathered, pile ready. I see this end all spread out all over the place. And so my sense is that if we...
Was I wrapping up? Yes.
And so my sense is at 12 after 11, we probably ought to kick the other little pieces to...
We can do them really quickly if you'd like to clean these off your plate.
5 minutes?
You bet. Debt service, truthfully, the comments I was going to make we've already talked about, which is overall debt service payments will be down in 2010. We've already talked about the Pinecrest loan, the reduced capital costs for our police radio equipment. That's pretty much all there is to say about capital. The only thing I would note is, assuming we do move forward with bond financing for the Public Works facility, my expectation is that would be structured so that the first debt service payment would occur in 2011. We probably won't go out and borrow until we have a better sense of the construction. What I probably will be bringing forward to the council in the very near future is what's known as a reimbursement resolution. It essentially is the way for the city, if it wishes to reimburse itself for any cost it would incur prior to getting the bond proceeds. So it's just, we did it for the community center, as some of you may recall. Right now, until we know what's happening with interest rates, it's really hard to kind of know, what our debt service payments would be. I did, as I mentioned last week, get some information from the state, and based on, they have disclaimers all over the place because they don't know what's going to happen with the bond market, but based on that, we would probably be looking for $1.5 million at 10 years, about $180,000 a year.
Could you just, I think it's helpful if people understand what the APR, the effective interest rate is on that money.
Yeah,
Back when you told me I was...
Yeah, Councilmember Wright and I had asked about this last week, so I had sent the information to him, and I can forward it on to the rest of the council. Typically, when you see municipal bond issues, it's not like your mortgage where there is a set rate every single year. There's usually some variation in the rates over whatever the term is, whether it's 10, 15, 20, or 30 years. So what you tend to see is what is the kind of the true interest cost over the life of the bonds. What the state gave me essentially had a true interest cost of about 2.81%, which is just phenomenal borrowing rates for money to do capital projects. So we'll see if those rates hold.
Which would actually say you might want to...
Borrow sooner.
Get out of here. You might want to not pay $500,000 towards the facility, but retire debt that's at a higher interest rate.
Right.
And borrow more to do the facility.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I can certainly talk to my contact at the state is whether there's an opportunity through the next issuance, and they tend to do them twice a year, so it'll probably be the fall, will probably be the first opportunity, is whether there's an opportunity to either do any refinancing through that program or whether we should go to a private lender and see if we want to try to refinance some of our existing debt. That's really all I had to say about debt issuance. Truthfully, most of the stuff was non-departmental. We just sort of covered it in conversation. What I was going to mention was just the, in the non-departmental section of the budget, under personnel costs is where you'll see the workers' compensation insurance increase we've already talked about. We've talked about the contribution to the equipment replacement reserve, which is up by $250,000 compared to this year. Truthfully, almost everything that I was going to say about the non-departmental, we've sort of talked about it. The only thing I would just comment on is the small community grants program the council has talked about a couple weeks ago. There is funding in the non-departmental section of the budget to the tune of $20,000, for that program. We have included in the non-departmental section $160,000 for the state homeowners property tax credit. This is essentially a match to an existing state program, which is geared towards low and moderate income homeowners. There are income restrictions, there are assessed value restrictions, so essentially we just get a report from the state and then we match a certain portion of that. The one thing I did just want to note, and council may want to talk about this later in the budget process, is as you look at that departmental budget, you'll see kind of a decrease in the expenditures that are classified as miscellaneous. There were a lot of one-time grants that are in the current year budget. It was the $30,000 for Historic Tacoma, the $20,000 for the Mosaic Project, and $25,000 for the Community Indicators Project. I did not include anything in the proposed budget for continued funding for the Community Indicators Project since this budget was prepared. I believe the council has gotten information from Bruce Baker requesting continued funding, so I did just want to call out to you that there is not funding for that project, and that may be something you want to talk about, whether you agree with that decision or not as you go through the budget process.
And the small grants money is in for 20,000. We kind of talked about, when we had that discussion, that we had 5,000 in this year's budget and that we weren't going to use it, and we were kind of thinking about it rolling over, even it goes into the fund balance and we start clean.
Right.
We were thinking about it as the 5 that we had in this year that we didn't use,
Right.
and making it 20 next year.
Right, and that's what's in the budget, is the 20. So that's all I was going
And
to say.
so it was kind of like 5 from this year and 15 from next year,
Yeah.
but it is 20.
Correct. So that's what's proposed. So that's all I had to add.
Any questions? We're adjourned.
Thank you.